G'day podcasters, welcome back to Season 4 of True Blue Conversations with your host, Adam Blum. We'd like to thank Tactical Recovery for sponsoring this show. Head on over to tacticalrecovery.com.au and use the code TRUEBLUE for one hell of a discount. Tactical Recovery, magnesium-based muscle care, salty products for sore fuckers. Welcome, loyal listeners of True Blue Conversations. Today's episode is proudly sponsored by Australian Warfighter Coffee. Veteran owned and run, driven by a simple yet powerful motto: people over profit. Every dollar goes towards supporting veterans and first responder charity groups. Head on over to AustralianWarfighters.com and use the code TRUEBLUE for your exclusive discount. Because let's face it, any other coffee is just brown sadness water. Now, let's get on with the show. Raise your glasses, podcasters. This episode of True Blue Conversations is brought to you by Wet Canteen Bottling Company, the perfect way to commemorate and celebrate life's most special occasions. Elevate your moments, savour the taste, and make them truly unforgettable with Wet Canteen. Head on over to wetcanteenbottlingco.com.au and use the code TRUEBLUE for your exclusive discount. Now, on with the show.
G'day, welcome back to True Blue Conversations. I'm Adam Blum. Today's special guest is British RAF air crewman, veteran, and author of Chinook, crew chick, Liz McConaghy. And Liz joins us today to talk about her 17-year career in the RAF, which included 10 deployments to Afghanistan and 2 deployments to Iraq. And also, she'll be talking about her life after service. Hi, Liz. Thanks for joining us on the show.
Hi, Adam. It is so nice to be here, and it's been a while in coming, hasn't it? But we finally managed to get it sorted.
It has, but
pleasure.
It's good things come to those that wait, and it's a pleasure to have you on. So, Liz, before we get into your career, let's go back to a young Liz. What was life like growing up back in the younger days, and what were you like at school, sport, and do you have any brothers and sisters?
Yeah, so I had a pretty idyllic childhood. You know, there was me and my 2 brothers. My older brother was mad keen in the army, which I'll come back to in a minute. And we kind of lived in the country and had a great time growing up. You know, I was a bit of a tomboy when I was a youngster, and then hit high school, and it was actually a grammar school I went to, so a little bit posher than a high school. And the basically from, you know, arriving there, got caught up in hair and makeup and boys, and suddenly got distracted from all things kind of army and playing in the woods and whatnot. But being at a grammar school, it was very much hammered into me that you had to go to university and get a degree if you're going to make anything of your life. And I certainly didn't believe that in my heart. You know, I thought I want to do something that's really different, and I want to do something that you know, might make a difference in life. And because my brother was really into the army his whole kind of growing up, he ended up joining the army at age 17, or went up to do his entrance test when he was 17. In a place back in Northern Ireland where we grew up. And I went with him for a bit of moral support, as you do, as his little sister. And on the table while he was in doing his exam, there was a magazine, and it had a guy hanging out the side of a helicopter on it. And I remember looking at this magazine, and I think I was only about 16 or so at the time, and thought, how cool is that job? So I asked the guy in uniform about it, and I said, what's this guy on the rope? And what's that job? And he said, well, for starters, it's not a rope, it's a wire. And the job title is helicopter crewman. And that was me. I literally looked at that magazine that day and thought, that is pretty goddamn cool. I really want to do that job. And basically made the application to kind of join the Air Force, and was really lucky and got accepted to join, and went off and left Northern Ireland on my 19th birthday and never looked back.
So, but like before your brother joined, was there any other family members that had served before both of you, or was you two the first?
No, we were the first. You know, he's still serving, and actually is at a base just down the road from where I currently am. But yeah, so we've kind of just mirrored each other's careers, and we've actually been to war a few times together, which in itself was quite interesting. We probably saw each other more in a war zone than we actually did on UK soil at one point, so that was quite funny. But yeah, no like background in the military whatsoever, so it's kind of unique, I guess, that we both went in.
Absolutely, and for you being, like you said, it was the seed was planted that day for you when you went and saw your brother, and so for you finishing school, it was like, yep, that's where I'm going. That's exactly like it was just right. Get the marks that I need to. Because what sort of schooling was in? Like, did you have to get like a high sort of score to get in to be an air crewman?
Yeah, so the way it works is that actually to be an air crewman in the RAF, you don't need anything other than GCSEs, Maths, English and Science. And I mean, I quite enjoyed my GCSEs, and that was before I'd done any kind of application to the RAF. So, and I've got some really random ones. I've got a GCSE in Latin and geology and archaeology and all these random ones because I enjoyed them at the time. But then whenever I applied to join the RAF and got accepted, I kind of totally took my eye off the ball for my A levels. And I got C, a D and an A, I think, in my A levels, but you didn't need them to join the RAF. So it was in that very, I've already got my golden egg here,
Yep.
and I really need to focus on my A levels, which again, looking back, I wish I had maybe worked a little bit harder at them, not for the grades, but also for the knowledge, because, I did geology as an A level, and I've been to some amazing places around the world, and I wish I had the knowledge retention in my head still to be able to say, oh, this is that, and this is that, and sound really clever. For no other reason than that, really. But so I didn't need A levels, even though I got them. And in terms of how do you get into the RAF, so not only do you need the GCSEs, but you have to do a thing called aptitude tests. Now, aptitude tests are basic computer-based tests that you can't practice for. You either have aptitude or you don't. It's like a reaction thing. You either can react quickly to something, you can't, but it's very hard to train that, actually. And the aptitude tests are done for anyone who's going into an air role. So pilots, navigators, crewmen, which was my role, or indeed air traffic, because they are involved in the air system as well. And there's a variety of tests that go from the screen goes blue and you have to press the blue button. There are sequences of numbers that you have to remember. That's very much focused on air traffic. There is pilot-based ones where there's like a ball on the screen and you have to keep the ball in the middle of the screen whilst remembering the numbers on the right hand side, and various different things, or like Jenga puzzles. You've got to make the puzzle fit, and that's quite a crewman oriented one, because that's essentially what my job was my life. So anyway, you do these aptitude tests, which lasts about an hour, and this computer generates a score for you, and depending on what your score is, you either get in or you don't. Or so you might make the aptitude for pilot, and they test you for everything. So I actually made the aptitude for navigator on mine, but my arms were a centimetre too short, which in hindsight didn't really matter, because all I wanted to do was be that guy on the rope. So, if I'd have got the aptitude to be the first ever direct entrant Red Arrow, it still wouldn't have mattered to me, because I just wanted to be a helicopter crewman. But that's how it works, really. So some people, will have the aptitude for air traffic, which is actually quite high, because air traffic is a very aptitude focused job. That sequence of numbers, which I am crap at. You tell me a phone number and I will instantly forget it, and I'm really rubbish at remembering those numbers when you have to authenticate on something. I cannot remember a series of numbers, but I'm pretty good at putting puzzles together. So again, my job is very much based on practicality. It's one of those jobs where, I joke in the book that we had pilots who could work out the square root of a jam jar, but they couldn't take the lid off. And that is very much, pilots versus crewmen. We're the practical doers, and they're the thinkers, and they're the brain of the operation. we're the body that gets the stuff done. So yeah, I passed my aptitude, and that's basically then how you get selected to go through. You have to do other things as well, like a medical, obviously, which is much more strict now. I think back in my, they don't let you in with shin splints and things like that now, whereas back in my day, you could pretty much, as long as everything was pretty much attached and working, you could get in. You do a fitness test as well, and you do an interview as well. So all those little things to kind of get you in.
And I was laughing when you said aptitude tests, because I hate them and I'm shit at them. So, and it's, I think there's a lot of people out there that either they are your friend or they're not your friend. And like you said, you can either train, like you've either got it or you don't. And if you don't, I know, because I've had to work hard to get to where I've got to, and it's, like I've had to like really study hard to do it. And like, as you say, you've either got it or you don't. And for you, obviously you had it, because you got in and had an awesome career. And so for you, your 19th, like you go on your 19th birthday, obviously you went Chinooks because they were in the Air Force, but did you ever consider Army or Navy, or was it always for you, it was always the RAF?
So how it kind of transpired was, so my brother, he joined the army, and I really wanted to travel the world and play loads of sport because I was quite sporty at school, played hockey at school. I thought I want to travel the world, see loads of different places, and play hockey. So that very much still lent itself towards the RAF and the Chinooks. Well, the helicopter fleet were mainly operated by the RAF. So for me, it was always kind of the obvious choice. And when I went up for one of my interviews at Palace Barracks back home, which was one of my initial interviews before I got sent across for the aptitude tests, I pulled my little car into the lay-by there at the guard room because you have to get a pass to go into camp. And I was only 17. So I pulled my little car in and I got out of the car, and a Chinook came whacking over the top of me at about 20 feet to land. And I mean, you guys have got Chinese over there, so I know that you know obviously what they look like and sound like, but the
Yep.
sound of a Chinook is right in the chest.
Yep.
And the belly of this thing just went right over the top of me. And I just looked up and honestly just fell in love. I thought, that is so awesome. That is exactly what I want to work on. So that was the point in time where I just went, Chinooks, it's got to be Chinooks, Chinook, Chinook, Chinooks. And I only found out many years later that actually it was really unusual for Chinooks to go into that particular landing site because it was in a car park where they had to clear the entire car park because the downwash could pebble dash the windscreens and whatnot. So it was a huge amount of effort to go into that landing site. It was very rarely done, only for VIPs and the odd important tasking day. So it feels like fate that I was actually parked my little car that day and this Chinook came right over the top of me. So it was only ever going to be the RAF for me, really. And the irony being is that there's me wanting to join to travel the world and play loads of sports, and I never did either, really. In terms of, I didn't go to any nice places. I went to plenty of dusty places and got shot at. But in terms of this, there's this kind of, I guess, image of the RAF where they just travel the world and check in and out of hotels. And I think the shiny fleet, as we call them, which is the fixed wing fleet, very much do that a lot of the time. But when you're on helicopters, you stay mainly in tents or in deserts. And in terms of playing sport, because you're deployed pretty much anywhere between 3 and 6 months of the year, there's very little chance of you ever making a team or being able to do any sport with any continuity. So I never did either.
I know from the book when you and a few of the other veterans that I've had on back here in Australia talk about the dust and the, especially being in the deserts and that fine dust. And when they came, like when you guys would go in, couldn't see a hand in front of you, and just, and that, like, there's a photo in your book, which actually is a great example of, you go, there's a Chinook in there somewhere over in Afghanistan where you were, and it's crazy. Like, and for you, like, as you say, you didn't get to really do sport, but you as I said at the start of the podcast, 10 tours of Afghanistan, 2 tours of Iraq. Yeah, you did. That's a lot of war fighting over a long period of time, but before we get into that side of things, what was it like for you? You looking back now, you joined the RAF at 19. Did you feel ready for the responsibility that was about to be put on your shoulders? And were you were you naive at that young age, do you think?
Such a good question. So, yes, I was so naive. So naive when I joined up. I don't know if you know much about the geography of England, but I'd obviously come from Northern Ireland. I'd never been to England before, and I thought like Leeds was near London, and then like they're the opposite ends of the country. I had never been over to the UK. I had very limited experience of driving, even on motorways and stuff. I was a properly country bumpkin. So to then join the RAF at 19, and the way it works as aircrew is that 3 months later, after basic training, we come out as a sergeant, which is quite a huge rank to carry on your shoulder. And the reason why you come out as a sergeant is so that when you're down the back of the aircraft, you have a little bit of authority over the troops and the squaddies that you're flying, so that you can brief them, you can direct them where to sit, and you have that little tiny bit of authority so that they will actually listen to you. Whereas if it was a corporal telling a corporal what to do, it just wouldn't work. So you come out as a sergeant, which is a huge rank to carry at the age of 19, having only been in the Air Force for 3 months. And I'm walking around with this rank on my shoulder. Now, bearing in mind, there are some guys who are in the mess at the same time as me, who are, 45 years plus and have been in the Air Force for 20 years, and they've just made the rank of sergeant. And here I am walking around age 19 wearing the same rank as them. So there's a huge amount of disdain, and we were called plastic sergeants, and that was our nickname at Cromwell. So, but thankfully you're still in the bubble wrap, I guess, of the training system. So you're somewhat protected because there's about, 100 plastic sergeants walking around. So it's not just you. And the same when you get to the next camp, which was Shawbury, which was very much full of air crew. So nearly it was top heavy on plastic sergeants and plastic ranks more than the old and bold, whereas Cranwell with their good mix. So it was a bit of a baptism of fire, really. But I think the naivety was my strongest weapon, because actually the amount of things you do in basic training, I'd never fired a weapon before. I'd never even been in a helicopter until I started my basic helicopter training. But the naivety brings excitement. So when you don't know what's coming, things can be quite exciting. And, I remember through basic training, getting up at, 4:00 in the morning to iron my bed space, because you have your inspections every morning, having slept on the floor, and I'm getting up and I'm ironing my bed, which is already made, and I'm ironing it. And I mean, you think now, looking back, like, who in their right mind does that? But at the time, it was just this big, hoop to jump through, and it was all fun and games, and it was great. And even some of the exercises you go on, they're absolutely crap. But you know what? It's all a big game. And looking back now, I'm kind of glad that I didn't have an adult job and an adult life before having to go into that, because I think it would have been much harder to swallow a lot of that stuff had I not been so naive. And even whenever I got through into my more sort of in-depth aircrew training, we do a thing called the dunker, which is where you do your underwater escape training. So you're essentially strapped to a huge metal frame that simulates a craft, and you're put under the water and you're rolled over. And there's all these stories about people nearly drowning, and there's a thing called the suicide chair that you have to do beforehand, and it's called, you're like, suicide chair, who came up with that name? It's awful. But you think, well, the first time you do it, it's all quite novel, and it's a bit of a game again. And certainly my escape and evasion course, which probably was the hardest course I ever did in my Air Force career, and that's the one that you basically go through your interrogation, you go on the run, you get caught by a hunter force, you do an interrogation phase, all that kind of stuff to train you in case you go down behind enemy lines. And it's brutal. I mean, it's a hard course to do. You learn a lot about yourself in it, and certainly about your mental capacity. But it's one of those things where you've just got to get through it. And when you're young and you're naive, I guess you can just keep, you can bite your tongue and get on with it. So naivety can be a very good thing sometimes.
And you mentioned in the book that you, during your basic training, that there was, for you, the hardest part was your fitness, like your running and where you were like, when there was people that were just encouraging you to say, come on, Liz, you can do it. Like, you can do it, you can get there. And for you, apart from your helicopter training, was that the hardest aspect, was like trying to get that fitness level to just get past your basic training? Was that a really hard part for you?
Yeah, it was definitely up there. Fitness for me never came naturally. And funny enough, as I progressed in my RF career, I became extremely fit and did Ironman triathlons and all sorts of stuff. But at the start of it, fitness was always a thing. And I was always at the back. And that in itself is quite a mental challenge. When every time you do a squad run with 30 people and you're always the last one over the line, it's hard, but I very much since day one in the Air Force, from the day I unpacked my bag out of the bottom of the bus and moved into the block, it's a team. It's a huge team effort. There's only 3 girls in my basic training. So I was one of 3. I was the youngest on the course by a country mile, but everybody just encourages everyone. And I felt like, everyone looked at me like their little sister. So although I was always the last one over the line, it was like that Private Benjamin film. Everyone just wanted me to get over the line. And, it didn't really matter how you got there as long as you got to the line. So the fitness was a challenge, but also the RAF have this brilliant rank system where everything is a line on your shoulder. So once you get commissioned, the rank slides go up as lines, and it's incredibly hard to get your head around. So we do a lot of, we had to learn the rank structures, and not just for the Air Force, but for the rest of the Army as well. And I think for my first couple of months, I was saluting everything, including the corporal in the main gate. I just couldn't get my head around the rank structures and things like that. So, there's a huge amount thrown at you for those first 3 months, and you've just got to try and sponge up what you can. But what I really did learn is, as long as you're part of the team, we have a saying that the British military called Jack, and Jack is someone who doesn't pull their weight, someone who won't make the brews, won't make the teas and coffees, or someone who just, gets their own kit and doesn't get everyone else's. And as long as you're not Jack, as long as you play the game and are a part of the team, you'll always be looked after. And I think that's really key. And that was something I learned from day one. And it helped carry me through not just basic training, but my entire career.
And I think, well, it's something that's here in Australia as well, is that your jack as well. The veterans use the same, like it's the same here in Australia that if you're being jack, you're being a jack.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, so it's across the board. And I was laughing when you said that with your basic training that, you got out in the ironing of the sheets, you hadn't slept. And a lot of the veterans I speak to did exactly the same thing, slept on the floor, but it's just what you did. Like apparently,
Yeah.
that's just what you did. But out here they would clue on to, oh, hang on, what's going on? Like it's immaculate. Have they actually slept in the beds? Like, yeah. So yeah, no, that's just what you do. Like, and so you pass. So you pass out. You finish your basic training, and then where were you first? Like, where was your first squadron? Where did you end up getting posted to?
Yeah, so I finished Cromwell, which was like the basic training of running around with pine poles and all that fitness stuff we talked about and learning the ranks. After Cromwell, we go on to a place called RAF Shawbury, which is in Shropshire, which is the sort of Midlands of England. And that's where I started my basic helicopter training. So it was a squadron called 60 Squadron. And we operated on a thing called the Griffin helicopter, which is very much like the Huey. It's basically a derivative of the Huey helicopter. So think old Vietnam War films. And it's a great little helicopter for training. It really is. And there's no space in it whatsoever. All the instructors just about squeezed in. But so that we spent 6 months there, and I was basically summer school. I was really lucky. I had my 6 months over the summer at Shawbury, kind of from spring through to autumn. And that was like learning how to use a radio, how to do a bit of navigation, very basic navigation, and then how to voice marshal. So voice marshal for a crewman is our basic bread and butter. It's what we are put on the aircraft to do. And voice marshalling is essentially we, as the crewman down the back of an aircraft, are the pilot's eyes and ears. So he can only see out the front. And it's obviously quite important on something like a Chinook, where it's like 100 feet long or 99 feet long. So there's a huge amount of cabin behind him he cannot see. But the same in the Griffin, or the Huey, if you want to refer to it as that, he can't see where the tail rotor is. So it's our job to clear the tail rotor and to also clear the whole helicopter into some of the clearings and landing sites we go to, because, the world is not necessarily always flat and a big airfield. You have to go and put these helicopters into some really small places, sometimes on slopes. And also part of the job is to pick up the underslung loads. So, our job is to talk the aircraft into wherever we need it to be to achieve that aim, and make sure that the tail's clear, that the tips aren't going to strike something. So we learn that very basic voice marshalling skill, and also how to pick up a small underslung load. So the Griffin only had one hook, so it was really simple. So we spent 6 months doing that, and then we got to pick which helicopter we wanted to go on. Well, when I say we got to pick, we got given a dream sheet, and you get to fill in options A, B, and C, or 1, 2, and 3 of where you want to go. So obviously for me, it was Chinook. But the Air Force at the time operated the search and rescue fleet on Sea Kings, and we also had the Pumas, and we had the Merlins that had just come into service as well. So there was a few options to pick from, but as we've already alluded to earlier, for me, it was only ever Chinook, and I was very lucky by the skin of my teeth got my dream. So I then arrived at RAF Odium, and I was the only girl throughout my helicopter training. After basic training, I was the only female on my helicopter training the whole way through. I'm the youngest by 9 years now. But again, I had 6 big brothers on my course. It was brilliant. And then when I got to Odium, it basically up to the ante. So the Chinook's a massive beast. You now having to clear a huge aircraft. You're also working with another crewman, because the Chinook has 2 crewmen down the back. So you've got to make sure that you're working as a team, not treading in each other's toes, or you're not trying to do everything and kind of, pissing them off because they've got a job to do as well.
Yep.
So it's kind of learning how to divvy those jobs up. And also now you've got 3 hooks. So you've got to be able to do triple underslung loads, which is quite a skill. Especially when things are getting tangled up underneath the aircraft, because nothing wants to fly like you want it to fly, trust me. And you can fit stuff inside. A Chinook can fit a 105 artillery gun inside. It can fit a Land Rover in a trailer. It can fit 40 troops or about 80 Gurkhas if you try. If it fits in, we'll take it most of the time. So you've got to learn how to manage all that and how to make sure the aircraft's still in CFG, which is center of gravity, so you're not going to nose over. And yeah, all those extra skills, plus self-defense systems and all the tactical flying that you have to learn to go to war. So I spent another 6 months learning all that, and then arrived on my very first squadron, which was 27 Squadron, in 2003. And so 2003 it was, and my first deployment was straight after the Falklands.
So just going back a sec there, Liz, so everyone, and I always bring this up in most podcasts I do, everyone knows where they were on September 11 in 2001 when the World Trade Centers were hit. Where were you, and was that another driving factor for you to, serve your country? And do you think that you would be involved in such a long war in Afghanistan and Iraq because of what happened on that day?
Yeah, I was working in a little coffee shop in a leisure centre on 9/11, and I had driven to work. My house was about 10 miles away. So I left the house and drove down to the coffee shop, and I'd already been accepted into the Air Force and was due to start on the 20th of September. So anyway, left the house, drove to the coffee shop and got into the coffee shop, and the phone rang. And a lady called Margaret picked up the phone and said, "Liz, it's your mum." And my instant thought was, what have I forgotten? What have I left at home? So I got the phone and mum said, put on the TV, because there was a TV in the corner of the coffee shop. So I went and put on the TV and we all went over knowing something big was going on. And just as the second plane went in to the second tower, and we all watched it, there was about 5 staff on, and Margaret elbowed me and went, "You're joining the Air Force in 9 days, Liz." And she went, "You're going to be busy." And honestly, never a truer word was said, because I don't think I had grasped the gravity of what I'd just seen and how it would subsequently impact my life. And I have to say, had that event not happened, I don't think I'd have had the amazing career I did have, in that, I got to see Iraq, I got to see Afghanistan. When I say got to see, I got to go and fight a war, which is what I joined the forces to do. I didn't join the Air Force to fly on a big empty Chinook and make holes in the sky. That for me is unfulfilling for an aircraft like the Chinook, and for me in terms of purpose. So I'm not kind of a war junkie, but I did join to do a job. And I was really lucky that, sadly, the events of that day led on to both of the campaigns, really, that I ended up involved in one way or another. So that was a really defining moment in my life. And also the Iraq invasion happened about a year and a half later. And I still remember watching that in the crew room at Shawbury, which is, our baby flying beginning. And we'd pulled in a big screen because we all knew it was going to happen. We'd pulled in a big screen and we put it up in the crew room, and it happened at nighttime, and the bombing of Baghdad. And we basically watched as the bombing of Baghdad took place, and the British Chinooks from 18 Squadron went over the Al-4 Peninsula and invaded Iraq with the Marines on the back. And I just could not wait. I couldn't, like, my basic training couldn't come quick enough to get it out of the way so I could hit the front line and get amongst it. And even when I arrived on my very first squadron at 27 Squadron, it was a couple of months before I was able to go to Iraq. And I remember seeing the guys from the squadron coming back, and they'd come off the bus, because they do like a Romont thing where a crew would go out and go out with another crew. And every time a crew came back, they go off the bus in their desert combats, and I was in my flying suit, my green flying suit, and these guys would come off in their desert combats with all their kit bags covered in dust. They'd all be tanned and slim, and they'd just be chatting in the crew room with all their mates they hadn't seen for 3 months, just about different landing sites and about this, that, and the other. And I just couldn't wait to be part of that club. I couldn't wait to go out there, and just even something as simple as being going to stores and signing out my desert kit. I just couldn't wait. And I think, for a lot of people, you join the forces, you don't necessarily do it for the money, because the money's not that good. You do it because it's such a purpose. You do it because you're going to make a difference in the world, and you're going to, certainly when I went to Afghanistan, the jobs people sometimes think that the military is quite a destructive and quite a hard-faced job. Whereas certainly the role I got to in Afghanistan, it had 2 sides to it. There was the, not attack helicopters, but certainly the deliberate ops, which was going to fight an enemy. But there was the saving of lives, and that is a compassionate role, and that is a huge amount of, honor, purpose, privilege, that MERT thing, which I'm sure we'll come on to later. But, there's 2 sides to every war. There's the war fighting, and there's the saving lives at the end of it, and making a difference to the people that are in that country. And I think, sometimes people forget that actually you can make a difference in the forces without necessarily having to fire a round.
Absolutely. No, I agree. And I think I always bring that question up, Liz, because, and it's not, it's not that you're, a war junkie or anything like that. It's the willingness to serve. That's what it is. It's that willingness to serve. And, everyone, like, I know I was 8 years old, and I turned the TV on and I was like, hey, where's my kids programs? Like, this is a movie. And then I looked and went, oh, actually, no, this isn't a movie. And then it changed the course of everyone's life. Like, everyone was affected by that day. That, and if you were born in that time, you knew where you were, you knew exactly what had happened. And it was just one of those things that it changed the world. That day changed the world, and we've never been the same since. And then, so we'll go forward to your first deployment to the Falklands. And what was that like? What do you remember of that deployment?
Not a lot is the honest answer, because the Falklands is famous for the bars, and every single section down there at the time when I went, which was back in 2003, I think, every single section had a little bar, because there was not a lot else to do either other than drink or go to the gym. So, that we as a squadron had a bar called the Lair. We had, the whole Chinook force had a big bar called the Loft. The Lot. And the catering squadron had a bar. The Herc boys had a bar. Air traffic had a bar. On a weekly basis, every single bar would have a night that it was having a quiz or doing something. So you would just pepper pot around these bars every night. Barely remember getting home because the alcohol down there is so cheap. And thankfully for me, the Chinook that was based there at the time was going through a primary service, so there wasn't a lot of flying to be done. But when we were flying, we were like the rock stars, because the only way to get around the whole island is via the Chinook, and there's only one Chinook. So if you're the Chinook crew, you become rock stars, and everyone wants to come and buy you drinks because everyone wants to come flying with you the next day, and people want to come hump riding and, sit on it. So as a young crewman going into that environment and being like, this kind of rock star was great, because everyone just wanted to know and get to know the Chinook crew. But yeah, there was a lot of boozing on that trip. But I went back again. It was actually my last tour many, many years later in 2017, and everything had changed. A lot of the bars had been shut down, and we were on standby at the time. So that particular time, because they used to say you go to the Falklands and you get fit or fat. The first time I got fat. The second time I got fit and did a lot of running and swimming, because it's great sports facilities down there, because there's not a lot else to do. But it was a really good place to go and cut your teeth as a crewman, because you are the kind of heartbeat of the island, and everything that needs to be moved has to go via the Chinook. So on a normal tasking day, I'd go in as a junior crewman, and it was my job to kind of look at the tasking sheet, see what needs to go where, and come up with the plan. So it was all on my shoulders, and done deliberately so that I could learn my skill. And there was landovers to be moved, there was freight to be taken, there was things to be brought back to the main base. So it was, again, a big game of Jenga, lots of moving parts, and it's basically like sorting out a day shopping or a bus route. You've got to figure out what can fit in where, what you need to get rid of at one place before you can pick something else up at another place, and kind of what's the most efficient way to do it, because there's no point in dropping something off at the bottom of the island, going up to the top to pick something else, and then having to go back to the bottom. So it's all very much kind of working out that daily kind of program. But it was great fun, really good fun. And the Falklands is also famous not just for the bars, but for having 4 seasons in one day. So I went down there in March, and you could expect wall-to-wall sunshine, or like snow drifts the next day. So, and again, that was a challenge for flying, because some days you'd take off in the morning and the weather would be absolutely beautiful, and then you'd be groveling the whole way back into camp later on that afternoon. So it tested every single skill set, fuel management, navigation, payload management, met kind of forecasting. So really, really great place, a good playground to go to as a first tour for sure.
And I think for you, I think you said it in the book that it was great for you to, as you said, you cut your teeth to then go into Iraq, and then you come back from the Falklands, and then you quickly deploy to Iraq, and you were and I'm going to read this list. I'm going to read this out. So you were the youngest air crewie to deploy to Iraq at just 21. And you were also the only, as you said at the start of the podcast, you were the only female crewman on the Chinook wing for 5 years. That's correct. Yeah, 5 years. Yep. And so what was that like for you? You obviously you'd cut your teeth in the Falklands, but then this was Iraq. This was different. What do you remember of that, of your first deployment to Iraq?
Yeah, so the warfighting element had finished. So Iraq was quite distinctive in that there was a warfighting phase, and then there was kind of a routine tasking framework phase, kind of peacekeeping mission after that. And I went out for that bit. So the warfighting had finished, and we were kind of basically just supporting the troops that were still on the ground by the time I got there. But I remember arriving, and the first thing I remember about Iraq was the heat. Getting off that aircraft, and it was a TriStar back in the day that we had, which was the RAF fixed wing that took us down there. So basically like a big passenger jet. And opening the doors, and this wave of heat hitting you, and it smells. The desert smells a funny smell. It's not a good smell either. But that heat hitting me, and within the first couple of days, we had to go and zero our weapons on the range, and the ranges are very exposed. And it was like midday we were doing it, and one of our engineers went down with heat stress on the day, like I think day 2, and he had to get medevaced. And I remember thinking, this is real now. This is, you don't have to be worried about getting shot at. You can actually go down with anything out here. I'm not in Kansas anymore. So that was kind of at the very start of that deployment. And then throughout the deployment, basically, we would go into a lot of the landing sites that had been either mortared or rocketed the day before or been shot at, 24 hours before. And I talk about it a lot in the book, this normality bar, because it was kind of the first time I was somewhere where we would have an int brief in the morning and there would be a threat. So we had the self-defense systems all armed up. But in terms of the threat being really, really close, it wasn't, because there was just no appetite for risk from the theatre commanders. So we just wouldn't go to places if there was a chance of getting shot at. It was very much that the idea of losing a Chinook, just wasn't even worth thinking about. So very much benign landing sites within an operational theatre. But there was certainly a risk. And that's where, that's normality bar started to climb in my head. And even what was called the IRT back then, which was the immediate response team, which was the flying ambulance, a lot of the things we were picking up were more benign injuries. So like vehicle incidents, people falling off roofs the odd time, appendicitis, I think we picked up once, so very benign injuries. But still, you've got to go and, get these people back to the hospital as fast as you can. But in terms of pure threat on your doorstep and in front of your face, it was quite minimal. And that normality bar, that's when it started to rise. And I think that's where, when we got to Afghanistan, that even in the early days in Afghanistan, there was only 3 forward operating bases we were using. So we were based out of Kandahar airfield. Bastion didn't even exist. And our main kind of bread and butter in the early days in Helmand was to build Camp Bastion. So on a day-to-day basis, our routine tasking was moving anything that would fit in the aircraft. So cement mixers, step ladders, cable drums, donkeys, whatever had to go to Bastion, we would sling it across the Red Desert to watch Bastion get built. But in terms of other footprints on the ground, we had a couple of British troops in Lashkar, a place called Garesh, it was called Fob Price in the early days, and Sangin, and a couple of Marines up at a place called Kajaki up at the north of Helmand Valley. So 4 or 5 places we would go to on a daily basis, and that was it. So again, small footprint of soldiers means that it was pretty benign, some of the stuff we were going to pick up on what was now the MERT, which was again just the airborne ambulance. It just got renamed. And the landing sites were still fairly benign. Now, as Afghan group, or as Helmand and Op Herrick progressed in terms of years, a year or so later, it got more and more kinetic, and we injected more and more British troops into the ground. And the more troops you got, the more bullets fly, the more IEDs get planted and stood on. And very quickly, things got very kinetic in Afghanistan, and that's when your normality bar just kept climbing, to the point where I look back now versus like my early days in Iraq and my last couple of days in Helmand, it would become routine to go into a landing site and be shot at, and we didn't think anything of it because we had normalized it in our heads so much. Going in somewhere where you're going to get rocketed and mortared was kind of normal jogging now, and normalizing that in your head is very dangerous, especially when you then come out of the Air Force, but also the MERT. So we'd gone in the early days from picking up, like say vehicle injuries and, the odd broken leg, to picking up guys who had no legs and bits of bodies, and watching people die in the back of the aircraft. And I mean, I remember my last MERT shout going to pick up an American who'd been killed, and we picked the body up, and then the medics handed me his foot in a clear plastic bag. And it was so normal. I just put it down on the floor and carried on my day-to-day business. And that says a lot looking back now at how normal that had become. And that normality bar had just climbed and climbed and climbed, which is a protection method, I guess, for you when you're doing the job. But when you leave the services, it's very, very hard to then bring that normality bar back to normal, and I think that's where a lot of veterans have this skewed version of the world of like what you stress about and what you don't. And sometimes my friends will get completely stressed about something, and I'm like, that is so not worth stressing about. I'll tell you what's worth stressing about. So yeah, that normality bar certainly started to climb in Iraq, but Iraq was pretty playground compared to what subsequently happened in Helmand.
So when you mentioned, as you say, you started to get into Afghanistan, and as the years, so it started to ramp up a lot. And for you at that, like you talk about in the book that, so you deployed, your first deployment was in 2005. And for you, what was that? What was it like first coming into like in contact with the enemy? Like for you, as you said, over time, you started to build a as you said, not a complacency, but it was the normal. But what was it like that first time when you were actually in contact with the enemy? What was that like for you?
Yeah, well, we left. So after my 2 Iraq deployments, we then didn't even have a chance to really regroup back here in the UK. It was a case of, the next, and the way our deployments work was we originally did 2-month tours, and then it was 10 months back in the UK and 2 months again. That was how Iraq went, and that was the same for the early days in Afghanistan, and then it became 3-month tours. So just so no one thinks we were doing 6 months at a time, which a lot of the other army units do, we were just doing 3 months. But basically, we came back from our last Iraq, had our normal time off, and then the next time we were away, it was Afghanistan. So no like a year to regroup or any chance to kind of recover the aircraft. It was out of the frying pan and into the fire. But I remember thinking that Afghanistan was going to be different, and I kind of knew already it was going to be different. And the reason being is that we fitted the miniguns to the aircraft. So the minigun's obviously in the front picture of the book, and it's a beast. It fires, well, it used to fire, the way it used to be set up was it had 2 triggers on the front, and these are tiny little triggers, like the size of a 1 penny piece over here in the UK, or a bottle top. Tiny little things that can unleash hell, which always used to make me laugh because it's called a minigun and there's nothing mini about it. But it had 2 triggers, and one was 2,000 rounds a minute, one was 4,000, lower rate and higher rate. And we used to joke, and this very much was a joke, that it was for women and children and for badasses. So for baddies, women and children. But obviously that wasn't really what we did. But it then got amalgamated into one rate of fire, which was 3,000 rounds a minute. So both triggers, no matter which one you pressed, it was 3,000 rounds a minute, which if you ever see a video of a minigun firing is like something out of Star Wars, because it just unleashes hell. It'll destroy a vehicle within seconds. And it doesn't really matter how good your aim is, because you're going to hit something with a minigun. But we fitted the miniguns to the aircraft, and we all trained up on them. And before that, only the Special Forces Squadron had miniguns fitted. So I knew that, you're not going to fit these weapons unless there's a threat there. And we kept an M60, which is the old, again, going back to Vietnam. And the reason why we have an M60 on the Chinook is because the Chinook's an American aircraft. So we had American weapons fitted, not a GPMG, which is a British weapon, which a lot of the other helicopters have. So we had our M60 on the ramp, so we could fit and remove it so we can get vehicles in. And I remember, these were all being fitted in the UK, and we were training on them. And so I knew that it was going to be, it was going to be pretty tasty. And when we first went out there, I say the first couple of deaths, actually, it was pretty quiet. Having that weapon fitted is as much of a deterrent without even having to press the trigger, because, if you see it fitted to the aircraft, it's not small. You're going to have some balls to open up on something like that. But I do remember the first time I got contacted, and my initial thought was, cheeky bugger. And it's so random. And I've spoken to a lot of people who have been contacted before, and the very first time you get shot at, your initial feeling is, how dare you? Like, you feel really offended. You're like, how dare you shoot at me? So that was my very initial kind of feeling, which is so random, I know. But yeah, it's very much how bloody dare you?
Yeah.
But the thing's fitted for a reason. It's not a chalk ice. It's not a water pistol. It's there to defend the aircraft. We're not in the game of hosing people down, and the rules of engagement were very strict in Afghanistan. So in the early days, it was Card Alpha for us here in the UK, which is rules of self-defense. So that means that you cannot use that weapon unless you have an honest belief that your life is in danger or the aircraft's in danger. There's going to be people on board that are going to die. In the middle of the kind of campaign, things ramped up a bit, and we got rules of engagement called 429 Alpha. And that meant that anything north of Highway 1, anyone you saw in a black turban was considered Taliban, and you were well within your rules of engagement to open fire on them. And some people did, but I still very much live my life by the fact that, it's having a weapon like that in your command is a huge, it takes a huge amount of respect, because if you pull that trigger, you have to live with the consequences for the rest of your life. No matter what the rules of engagement are, you still have to sit with the consequences. So I was very much with my own internal kind of rules of engagement that were Liz's rules of engagement, which was, if it's him or me, it's going to be him. And if you get to that point where I know if I don't open fire now, me or someone I know is going to die, then it's time to open fire. So yeah, throughout my career, I had a couple of tasty moments. But it's what it's there for. And sadly, unlike the troops on the ground, when they get shot at, they can take cover, they can go hide behind compounds, they can take a knee. We can't, we have to stand our ground behind that minigun and return fire. We can't lie on the floor of the Chinook. That's not what we're there for. We're there to defend the aircraft. So a lot of the time, I just spent most of my career hoping that I had like an invisible shield around me and it was going to protect me. And it certainly did. I've had some really close misses over the years. I had one bullet that came in over my head.
Lizzie's shot, you called it in the book. Yeah.
Yeah, I can put my finger in the hole when we landed, and then another bullet, a AAA round, which is a high caliber round, anti-aircraft, came up and was caught on the ballistic protection panel that I was stood on that night. And the engineers gave me both bullets. It was two separate occasions, but the engineers are very helpful. And when you land, they do their battle damage assessment and they patch the thing up. And usually they'll find the round somewhere and give you it. So I have 2 rounds in my bedside drawer. Don't really know what to do with. Maybe make some earrings or some cufflinks or something. But I've had very near misses, and I'm not unique in that. Nearly every Chinook crewman has probably got some similar stories of, like, if you'd been a foot taller or if you'd been stood a bit to the left or a bit to the right, you probably would have caught a bullet up. But we seem to, thankfully, touch wood, as a force, get away with it. A couple of guys have had very near misses. A couple of guys have been shot in the hand. Certainly some pilots have taken a couple of rounds in the cockpit, one to the foot and another guy to the head, but luckily his helmet saved him. So, we've certainly had near misses as an entire force, but we came out pretty unscathed. So we were very lucky.
And I think too, like, as you say, you've got RPGs. Like, you weren't flying into, it wasn't peace. It was like, for people that are going to listen to this, Liz, you were flying in with RPGs coming in over the top of the rotors. Like, it's not, like the chances, like you say, you've got to protect that. You can't run and hide. You're in a big Chinook. It's not a, they can't take off really quick and get away like smaller aircraft.
We're a bit of a lumbering beast.
Yeah. So,
and
yeah.
One thing I didn't mention in the book, which is quite interesting, is that so we were able to get the ICOM, which is the basically intercepted communications. So we would always fly everywhere in Afghanistan with 2 Apaches. So there'd usually be 2 Chinooks and 2 Apaches as an escort with us. For MERT, it was just a single MERT aircraft and then the Apache with us. But the way the British comm system was set up was that we could intercept the Taliban communications, and it would get fed up usually to the Apaches. So the ground call signs would intercept it. They'd feed it up to the Apache cockpit, and the Apache cockpit would ask us if we wanted it fed into our cockpit. Now, it was a double-edged sword, because sometimes you would hear the Taliban saying, they nicknamed the Chinook the fat cow, and they called the Apaches the mosquitoes. And sometimes you would, if you got the ICOM into your cockpit, you would hear on the radio basically saying, we can see the fat cow, there's 2 of them, they're coming over the ridge, there's 1 mosquito with them. So you kind of look around and go, yep, that's us. And that you knew that they could see you. And the next sentence would be, get the big gun ready. And then suddenly you're going, holy shit, they can see us, they're getting the big gun ready, which is really ridiculous, because you knew they were probably doing that anyway. But to hear it with your own ears is pretty daunting to the crew. But a lot of the time, we then switched on to the fact, a lot of the time, and it happened a few times with the force certainly, was they would say, set the big gun up to the south. They're coming in from the south. So we would then reroute and come in from the west, and then get ambushed coming in from the west. So they had switched on to the fact that we could hear them, and they would then use it as they were a very clever enemy. There's no 2 ways about it. The Taliban knew their skill. They were a hard enemy to fight, and they knew their country. And they were very quick at switching on to our tactics, including the rules of engagement. They would very quickly, because they knew in the early days, and certainly the latter half of Herrick, it was self-defense. So if they saw us pointing the weapon at them, they would very, very quickly put their RPG down on the floor, and we couldn't shoot them then. So even though we knew that was a Taliban soldier, we knew he had an RPG at his feet, unless he was pointing at us, we couldn't open fire. And that really was gut-wrenching, because you knew that he would then take the RPG off for another day, or he would shoot it at the ground troops. So it was, they were very clever in what they did. And they also had the invisible enemy. IEDs were pretty much how I'd say most of the casualties came out of Afghanistan were IEDs. And, that's a very, it's a horrible weapon to use, but the Taliban were switched on. So, hard enemy to fight.
Oh, and I think almost every veteran that I've spoken to, Liz, says the same thing. They people think that they were a really stupid enemy, and every veteran I've spoken to goes, no way, no, they were very switched on, knew what they knew their tactics. They would set their ambushes, and they would be they were very good at what they were good at their fighting. Like, you've only got to look back to years before when the Russians invaded, and the same thing. Like, so yeah, just they gave as good as they got. Essentially, they gave as good as they got, and and I guess for you, I know it probably sounds, the respect for both, like, it's that's a word you respect your enemy, because if you don't, you're going to pay the price. And that's
Oh, they're going to catch you out, yeah. And
yeah.
you know, I think their motivator, you know, they don't care when they die because they go off to a land of 1,000 virgins or whatever it is. But you know, so they've got that as a motivator. And you know, even coming back to what the British troops on the ground are motivator, you know, lots of people throw this words around, you know, a fight for Queen and country. I've not met a single veteran or someone I served with who will say I fought for Queen and country. We all love the Queen, don't get me wrong. You know, the Queen was awesome. She's one of my favorite human beings, but I never went to war for Queen and country. I went to war for the man to the left and the right of me. You know, I went to war because if I didn't go, one of my colleagues had to go in my place, and they had to potentially catch my bullet up or be in a Chinook that crashed that I was supposed to be on. So I had a job to do. I had to put my skin in the game, because if I didn't put my skin in the game, somebody else had to put theirs in. And I think most of the ground troops I know and speak to these days, certainly all the guys we, you know, carried in and out of that battlefield, they did it because of the guy left and right. They did it for their mates. You know, very rarely you hear anyone say I did for Queen and country.
Yeah.
But no, they were a very clever army. You know, we had various merch shouts where we would pick up casualties, and they'd always get searched before they got brought on the aircraft anyway. Even in the worst states, the casualties would get searched. And they still managed to smuggle it in a watch device that was strapped to one of the casualties, and another time an electronic device. Now, it sounds pretty minimal, but actually that was them testing to see what they could get onto the back of our aircraft. And if the worst case scenario, if they'd have managed to get an IED onto a casualty and then a casualty onto the back of our aircraft and blown up the aircraft, the damage that would have done in terms of hearts and minds for the whole campaign would have, you know, to lose a Chinook, to lose the Mert aircraft, which is blown up in the air, would have been, you know, probably a game changer for the whole campaign. You know, that's the kind of thing that would have meant, I think, the whole British forces extracting from Afghanistan. So it was pretty essential that we kind of honoured that and respected how clever they were.
Absolutely. And for you, you talk about in the book, and I want to get your thoughts on this, what was going through your head that day, that you had I think it was on your first deployment where you struck the wire at the Kajaki Dam. And what was going through your head that day that you struck that wire at Kajaki?
Yeah, so it was a normal tasking day. We'd gone up with another Chinook, and this was before the Apaches were with us in theatre, so we went everywhere as a pair of Chinooks. And the reason being is that if one Chinook went down, the other Chinook had the capacity to go and pick up the crew and passengers and get them safely back to Camp Bastion. So everywhere we went as a two-ship. And they dropped off their undersung load. We went in to drop off our undersung load. We transited out of the landing site and straight away went into a set of wires. Now, here in the UK, we do lots of wire recce flights. We like pore over the maps to check where the wires are, and a lot of our moving maps now will have the wires marked on them. And in the UK, if a new set get put up, we get notified of them within 24 hours. But it's not the same in Afghanistan. So this set of wires have been put up, and they were the huge 250 volt or 250 foot, you know, high voltage wires that I'm sure you guys have got over there. Anyway, we lifted out of the landing site and went straight into them. So the first thing I remember was this huge almighty bang. And in the 3 o'clock of the aircraft, because I was the crewman at the front door, I could see the wire sparking in the airflow and sparking at the end. And the smell of burning electricity just filled my nostrils. And I looked over my shoulder, and my other crewman had gone through the centre hatch, and thankfully was on his harness and was pulling himself back in because he'd been releasing the undersung load. So he was, and the jolt had put him through the hole. So thank God that day his harness saved his life and he was climbing back in. But the whole aircraft was wallowing out of control towards the ground, and it's not flat ground up at Kajaki Dam, it's all undulating sand dunes. And I thought we were going in. I honestly thought we were going in, and the pilot was shouting, "I can't see, I can't see." So I grabbed my harness, which is like basically a belt around the front of you with two little straps to release it. And I was holding those, thinking that we were going to go in and the whole aircraft is going to roll. So the only way I'm going to survive this crash is that I'm going to have to get out of this door as soon as we hit the deck. And about 15 feet from the ground, the co-pilot shouted, "I have control," and managed to pull us back into the air. So no shadow of a doubt, he saved my life that day. And then we had to try and get back to Camp Bastion. Now, if we'd hit wires here in the UK or anywhere else in the world, the first thing you're going to do is land on, shut down, check what's wrong with the aircraft. But you don't have that luxury in Afghanistan. And I certainly didn't want to put out to try my skills from my escape and evasion course. So it was a case of let's get ourselves back to Camp Bastion. So it was the longest 45-minute flight of my life. The other aircraft kind of did a circle orbit of our aircraft and checked for damage on the aft pylon, on the engines. to give us a bit of peace of mind that everything was still attached. You know, the way the aircraft was handling at the start, I thought we'd rip the aft pylon off because it was out of control so badly. But thankfully, the Chinook's battlefield helicopter is designed to take a whole load of impact. I've seen 1.5 feet come off one of the blades with an RPG before and being able to fly. I mean, it flies like a bag of spanners because it's all out of sync, but it'll still fly. And you know, I've seen damage to the ramp. I've seen it rip a fuel tank off and still fly. That thing is immense. As long as those rotors are still turning, you know, you can even lose one engine and the other engine will keep the rotors turning for you, because that's the way the system works. And as long as you've got, you know, you're within weight, that, you know, you can still fly. So we had to go back to Camp Bastion and shut the aircraft down. And I remember my brother was there at the time. He's an engineer now with the army depth that were there. And he came over the next day and said, "Liz, have you seen the Chinook in the hangar?" I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "They were lucky. Who was on that crew?" And I went, "Yeah, don't tell mum." So for many years after that, my mum had no idea. But that is definitely probably the closest I ever came, I think, to dying. And, you know, again, it's that respect, not just for your enemy, but, you know, the ground has got a probable kill of 1. And, you know, I remember seeing a Puma crash many years earlier back in Iraq, actually. And a Puma crash when it hit the deck in Iraq on Basra Air Base. And one of the crew died, the pilot died, he didn't get out. And I mean, that was very early on in my career, and that made me realize just, you know, you can be on your game as much as you like, but just a twist of fate or something you're not expecting, and it can be game over very, very quickly. So,
well, I know it's a good point you touch on there, Liz, because we actually had some of our Australians that were killed. Some of our special forces, 3 were killed in 2010. And then another 2 in 2012, and it was, you know, so as you say, they were just ready to go on their game. And people, like, flying is a dangerous thing. It's not, as you know yourself, you had your near miss that, like, as you say, that was probably that one near miss that you go, shit, I should have, you know, I should have died that day, or, you know, I was as close as it comes to, you know, dying that day. You know, and people don't realize that, you know, flying is, you know, it's a dangerous thing that, you know, and I know it too, because I do it. So, you know, it is. It's
funny though, because I've never felt as safe as in the back of a Chinook, which is ironic. And, you know, it's all about your comfort space, isn't it? You know, I remember being in Bastion and we were flying back to Kandahar to do a crew swap or something, and we were going on a Herc. So we checked in at at Bastion at the Herc air desk. And there was just the 4 of us sat there and one lonely guy. We were like, "Mate, come on over and you know, tag in with us." And he was EOD. So basically, you know, exploding bombs and looking for IEDs out in Helmand. So probably, I think, the most dangerous job anyone could do.
Yep.
And he said, "Well, what are you guys doing with it?" Like, "Oh, we're the Chinook crew." And I was like, "What about you?" And he said, "EOD." And I was like, "Oh my God, I have massive respect for you." I was like, you know, I would never do that job in a million years. And he's like, "Are you kidding?" He goes, "You lot are the Chinook crew." He goes, "You're like the big flying bullet magnet." And it was funny how that perception, you know, he felt so safe doing his job and thought our job was so dangerous. Yet we were in our, you know, when you're in that space, you've trained for it, it's your comfort blanket, you feel very safe doing it. And, you know, I just thought that day I always remember that conversation of how he thought what we did was dangerous and we were the opposite way around. And yeah, I still, to this day, you know, it's probably where I've nearly died the most, but I still feel safest in Chinook.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, it's funny you say that, because most veterans that I have on, like, they go, "Dude, are you crazy you run into fire? Like, they go, we'd rather, they're like, we'd rather run at bullets than run at, like, you know, go into fire." And it's like, as you say, it's training. Like, for me, I have the utmost respect for fire, and but it's just training. That's just, you just get accustomed to your comfort of what you do. And it's like when you're on the Chinook, you just got comfortable and, as you say, not complacent, but it was the norm. Like, you know, having RPGs fly over the top of you, you know, that was the norm. That was just, you know, a normal day in Afghanistan. And as you say, it's funny how quickly it changes, doesn't it? Like, your perception of things changes. It's like when you first go into, you know, like a cut, like, you know, to a 2, 3, and 4, where you start to go, oh yeah, this is just, you know, the norm. Like, you know, that's what you do. And for you, like, so what did you do in your downtime? Like, did you just rest and just have a, like, what did you do on base when you weren't up in the air?
And so here in the UK, kind of you're always busy doing something, planning another trip or whatever. But starting out in Helmand, there wasn't a lot to do apart from either watch box sets of various Game of Thrones, or I mean, I think most people say they've watched that series 24 with Keith Sutherland. They've watched that back.
Yep.
That was Iraq. Iraq was 24. We watched 24, and we used to watch it in like a 24 marathon. So I remember once in Iraq watching it literally in sequence. So we watched the whole series in 24 hours. And like if you needed to go to the loo, you had to dive out to the portaloo and back, otherwise you'd miss a bit because no one was turning it off. So that was a lot of the time. And certainly in I remember in Helmand, Game of Thrones was the thing at the time, and I still testify that I'd never seen a single Game of Thrones episode. But a lot of people would watch box sets and things like that, because war sometimes it can be 99% of the time absolutely dull, and 1% of the time like the complete adrenaline, high octane. But I was a gym bunny, so I spent most of my spare time at the gym. And I look back now and realize that it was very much, at the time, I just thought, I'd rather be at the gym than watching something on the telly box and spending time in like a little tiny cabin with 4 walls. So I'd get myself off to the gym, and, to the point where I think at one point I could probably hand on heart say I was addicted to exercise because it was just my then time. And I look back now and realize very much it had become a coping mechanism. So the more trauma I was seeing and the more danger I was kind of being exposed to, the way I would empty my bucket at the end of a day would be go for a run. And it got to the point, I'd be running sometimes 10 to 15 miles every day. And I'd just go and I'd run and run and run. And mostly on the treadmill in Bastion, because actually running around the airfield was too hot, and you just suck up a load of dust. So I'd just go to the gym and run in the gym. And I remember people saying, is it not really boring? And I think that was my point. I didn't have to think about where I was going, what my route was, had I got enough water, even what time it was just there in front of me, and I could just run and completely numb my mind. And I look back now and realize just how much, as the years went on, that got worse and worse and worse, and I just ran and ran and ran more. And yeah, it had always been a coping mechanism, which was quite important then whenever I came out of the Air Force, which I'm sure we'll talk about later.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it was basically, that was kind of your only options, really. There was a couple of coffee shops on camp, and we used to go off for a coffee sometimes as a crew and whatnot. But life revolved around eating times and various box sets on TV. And it was a simple life. There's nothing simpler than being at war, because you don't have to worry about going to get the shopping in. You don't have to worry about filling your car with fuel. Well, not really. You don't have to worry about paying a mortgage or any of that stuff, or, getting cash out. You're not even allowed to take your mobile phones, because they were deemed, they can still be used as listening devices. So we had to leave our mobile phones here in the UK. So it's a really simple life. And I quite miss that, really. Yeah.
And I think, so you mentioned in the book about op certain death, and what was op certain death, and can you explain that to people who that's op certain death, like straight away? What was that, Liz?
I think you guys were involved in that as well. So we used to do these things called deliberate ops, and deliberate ops where basically the intelligence was gathered by our officers or various NATO officers, and they would identify Taliban strongholds. And we would fill the aircraft up, usually with like 30 troops per aircraft, and we would have like a minimum number of boots on the ground. So, for some ops, it would be 60. So 2 Chinooks, some it would be 30. And we would basically go and deliver these guys to known compounds or bad lands. And they would jump off the back of the aircraft first thing in the morning, first light, and go and basically hunt for baddies and weapons. It's probably an easy way to sum it up. But op certain death specifically was Musakala. So Musakala was a DC hub halfway up the Helmand Valley, which the British soldiers had occupied in 2007, I think it was, and then very publicly handed it back to the Taliban. And then it was deemed theatre intent that we were going to retake Musakala, because it was such a pivotal stronghold halfway up the valley. And it was, pretty important that we actually got a grip of it. So op certain death was created, or this op to take Musakala back started to gather pace, and it was mainly led by the Americans. But we had all sorts of, we had Aussies, Kiwis, the Dutch were involved, British Chinooks. I don't think we had British Apaches at that point. So like an air package of about 20 aircraft with soak overhead of the predators and all sorts of stuff. It was huge. It was the biggest thing I'd ever been involved in. And the lead up for it went on for about 3 weeks. And it was all secret squirrel stuff. Nobody was allowed to talk about it. Absolutely no mention of it going back home. So it was, super, super secret stuff. And we were in briefing, the big hall, briefing it with the Yanks over and over again. And the Yanks love to do this stuff well. It's almost like watching an American movie with the Yank commander at the front, giving us all the direction. And then the last day of briefings, we went out of the hangar and we had our picture taken as a squadron before we walked out to the aircraft. And we'd never done that before. And in the run up to it, it had gathered so much pace, we started calling it Up Certain Death because we were so convinced we were going to die on this thing. And our boss was like raging. He kept saying, "Stop calling it that. No one's going to die." And we're like, "No, it's Up Certain Death." So we give it that nickname. And we nicknamed lots of things that after this particular moment, and thankfully none of them were. But so off we went, got our picture taken. And if I didn't think we were going to die before then, I was certain we were going to die after having our picture taken. I was like, this is going to be up in some museum somewhere in like 20 years' time. The few that never came home. And then I went out to do my walk around of the aircraft, and the American padre, who's like the priest, had gone around all of the aircraft involved and blessed them with holy oil. So we had a little holy oil cross on each of the weapons. And I remember looking at it going, we're going to die. We're actually going to die today. But anyway, off we went. It was immense. I mean, we had a chat before we started recording, didn't we, about the sound of Chinooks, and we have them all lined up.
Yep.
So imagine 20 aircraft all turning and burning in Kandahar airfield at the same time, lining up and all taking off one after the other. It was immense. And I think the Taliban knew we were coming because we got there and not a lot happened, but it was successful because we took back Musa Qala. So, and that probably had a huge dent on the rest of the campaign and how the campaign went. So, but yeah, Up Certain Death became nothing really.
But I think what it shows me, and I think the black humor, like and every veteran has, and every first responder has a black humor, and like, but I guess for you, was there did that fear ease as you were going through Afghanistan throughout the years? Were you get and I know it probably sounds, but did you build a little bit of comfort that, okay, if I am going to die, I'm dying serving my country? Or was there always that fear that this could be the one that I'm not coming back from?
Yeah, well, so I've got a tattoo on my wrist that says "Fear Not." And, that's not about not being scared. That is about, knowing that you're going to be okay. No matter what happens, you're going to be okay at the end of it. And I've always, I can roll my flying glove down and I can look at that anytime I'm holding the minigun. I remember going into some deliberate ops and just looking at those words and just going, no matter what the outcome of today, Liz, you're going to be okay. And I'm not a particularly religious person, but I do believe that no matter what happens, I would be okay. But I think, coming back to the normality bar, I guess, as the years went on, you didn't really feel fear. And I think the only time I think that feeling of fear maybe crept back in. And I think, it's probably the first time I've ever said this to anyone, is probably the last couple of deaths. Maybe my last death where I knew it was our last deployment in Helmand. And I think, I wouldn't say we'd taken our eye off the ball, but we were definitely complacent. I think as a force, we were tired. The aircraft were tired. A lot of people felt the wind down from the whole campaign. Bastion was being ready to hand back to the Afghan National Army. We'd come back and, things were being, labeled up to go back to the Afghans and stuff. And it was, an aircraft were being taken out of the pool of aircraft at Bastion and being sent back to Kandahar to then go up to Kabul. So there was very much this vibe of, we're nearly done. But there was still some big tasty ops happening. And, I remember thinking this would be the classic moment in history where we're all nearly about to go home and something will happen. And I think that very much that feeling was definitely in there for my last deployment was, this, if it's going to happen, it'll happen now. And I think I've sort of had this feeling throughout my entire life that I would die in the back of a helicopter. And I think that last day, I thought, well, this is your last chance for that moment to happen, Liz. So yeah, I think there was definitely, the fear wasn't there for most of my career, but maybe that last little tiny bit, more of a anxiety rather than fear, but
yep.
It was definitely there. And thankfully I've left the Air Force now, so I'm hoping that feeling of dying in the back of a helicopter will never come true.
Yeah, well, let's hope so. You're still here, and we'll get into towards the end of what happened with leaving the Air Force and that. But what grabbed me the most in your book was the there's where you referred to your time in Helmand was some of the best and worst times. And for you, looking back now, what are some of the better memories that you had compared to your worst memories in Helmand?
Oh, that's a brilliant question. No one's ever asked me that before. People ask me about best and worst moments of career, but not about Helmand. So I think, the worst probably day was we had a merch out where we picked up 5 of the rifles who had all been killed in one sitting up at one of the forward operating bases. And I'll never forget that sortie. I'll never forget going up there and putting the ramp down and watching 5 stretchers being carried on, all covered in a flag. So there was a rifles flag on one of the bodies. There was a British flag, a Union Jack on one of them. I think a Man United flag, a Welsh flag, and a Liverpool flag, maybe off the top of my head. But they all had a flag on them. And, watching their colleagues, 5 guys out of, company is huge. It's a massive attrition in one sitting. Just think of the impact of losing one of your mates, but losing 5 of them in one go is huge. But for the guys to have to carry those stretchers on, set the stretchers down, and they all touched the bodies and then went back out over my ramp to kind of go back into the fight. And, how do you do that? How do you go back and pick your weapon up and engage in a fight again after having lost 5 of your guys? Huge amount of respect for them. And I think I've managed to get through most of my career with a bit of a wink and a smile down the back. People come on the aircraft, they don't expect to see a female, they see me, give a bit of a smile, and we always get the job done, even if they've got all their kit to move. I'm not the strongest girl in the world, but they will help me out, or they'll we'll work at it together and we'll get their kit loaded on the back of the aircraft. But a wink and a smile that day wasn't going to change anything for them. So that was a really hard day to get my head around, and just thinking of that loss for the British forces was, I never lost my best friend or my dad or uncle or brother at war, but I saw everybody's father, son, uncle, brother that got killed. I saw all of that collective loss. And I think that was, that was probably the epitome of that, really, of that collective feeling of loss that I have from Mert. But I guess, it was that coming back to the highs was there was guys who would come over the back of the ramp on merch outs who had already died, who were dead on that stretcher, and the medics brought them back to life at our feet. And that's a testament to the medics that we carried. They were, I call them the flying angels, because they were phenomenal. They were front leading in their field, and certainly a lot of the lessons that they learned in Afghanistan came back to the home soils here. And at one point, Britain was the forward leading element on any gunshot wounds and blast injuries because of the lessons that were coming back from Helmand. So, to watch someone's life being saved on the back of a Chinook in the dark whilst you're doing tactical flying is phenomenal. And I guess that the best merch shot I think I had was we picked up a little girl who'd swallowed a spring. I mentioned it in the book, this little girl.
Yeah.
5 years old. Yeah, swallowed a spring and came on the aircraft, was just so scared, as you would be. A 5-year-old young Afghan girl, she sees weapons and she knows what weapons do, and is probably so scared she's being taken off by this Chinook and going to get taken somewhere and shot. In her head, I'm sure that's what she thought. And we got her back to Camp Bastion, and the British medics removed the spring. And I refer to it a lot in the book at the end. We gave her voice back that day.
Yep.
And I look at what we achieved in Afghanistan in terms of, it'd be very easy looking back now to think we achieved nothing, but we didn't. We achieved a lot in terms of giving the Afghan people a voice, giving Afghan females a voice for 20 years. And yes, it's not in a great state right now, having pulled out 2 years ago, but it wasn't all for nothing. We made a difference to those people for that time, and some of them will still have that voice, and some of them will have left the country and gone on to bigger things. And I do believe in this accumulative change. Those people are now out and about the world who will be looking back at their home country and being able to somewhere down the line make a change. So it was never for nothing. So I guess that little girl is probably the highlight of my career, because it for me, it sums up everything of what we did in Afghanistan.
And I love that right at the end. And I shed a tear when I read that part in the book. I actually shed a tear, and it was because you're right. We think of, like, in war, we think of, the soldiers, but we and the veterans, but the civilians, they're the costs that we don't often think of. And that was, I cried because it actually made me, the way you ended the book, it made me stop and realize and go, yeah, actually you did give it the voice. And like you said, it wasn't for nothing, because you gave them 20 years of, not having to have Taliban rule. They could, they could go to school, they could get an education, they could, they could actually do things that they weren't able to do those 20 years previous. So yeah, it wasn't all for nothing. And it was like, and you mentioned, and this is where I really liked what you just said, that for you, were you getting towards the end, Liz, were you getting tired of, and like, as you're saying, your bottle, like it was starting to, the bucket was filling up. Were you getting tired of seeing all that death and going, oh God, can I get home to just normality again?
Yeah, I think so. I think the entire Chinook fleet probably would say they were weary by the end of it. And, I remember, I was on my 10th debt. Some guys were on their first debt, and some of the junior crewmen and junior pilots, even, they couldn't wait to go out and get shot at. And they couldn't wait to get on MERT and, go and do a MERT out. And I remember thinking, be careful what you wish for. I'd seen it. I'd been ground down by it all those years. And, they couldn't wait to go and get shot at. But most importantly, the MERT, the MERT, they knew it was the biggest kind of task that we did and the most important task we did. And they couldn't wait to be signed off to be able to go on the MERT aircraft. And, maybe their first shout, they'd be picking up, 10 Afghan civilians who had all been shot in the crossfire or been blown up with an IED. And that's, it's a baptism of fire. And I always used to think, be very careful what you wish for. But yeah, watching there's no two ways about it. The Afghans were the hugest casualties of that war. And, I often wonder what success looks like. Like, we were never going to be successful in Afghanistan in terms of, you look back through history, and Afghanistan is a law to itself. It will always find its status quo of where it needs to be. And, I think in terms of the lives that we did save as well as the loss, we did, again, come what I said earlier, we did achieve something. So, but it's so many people say that we lost the war in Afghanistan. We didn't lose it because there wasn't a distinct, what success looked like. So, and sadly, and I think again, lots of veterans will feel the same, is that it probably made us feel alive. I feel very lucky to be a part of that campaign. And yes, we all lost people along the way, but my God, it made me feel alive. There's no two ways about it. Being at war was the best thing I ever did in my career. And I speak to a lot of guys who say the same. You ask them what they miss about their time in the army. Usually the first answer is the people. And secondly was being in Helmand. And yeah, it's weird how that one thing can make you feel so alive.
Absolutely. And for people so when Liz says MERT, it stands for Medical Emergency Response Team. So for people who aren't aware of what Liz is saying when she means MERT, that's what it is. So, but I think you're right, Liz. Like, I think that is exactly right, that you be careful what you wish for, but also like, I've often spoken to a lot of veterans that say the same thing. It was the best and the worst time of their lives. And you sum that up in the book of what you said with Helmand being some of the best times of your life, but also some of the worst. And I think that, a lot of them would say we would, for what we've gone through post getting out, and we'd still go through it all again, because that's what you sign. And we said it in the podcast at the start that, before we went to air, that you said that would I just want to go and turn in the air for no, you joined to go and fight a war. Like, it's like training for something that you never get to play in a grand final, but you've got all the training. But this was for you, exactly right. You went to do a job, and that was what you joined up for. And yeah, unfortunately,
I have so many veterans that I love meeting veterans now, because with the book site, and lots of people connect with me on LinkedIn and Twitter and social media. And I always ask people, would you go back again? And every single person I ever ask is like, in an instant.
Yep.
Just send me back there now, case in point, when the Ukrainian war kicked off, the amount of people I know who were ready to go and fight again, because it's that need to serve. We mentioned it earlier. It's that sense of purpose. And I think as someone who's in the military or does what you do, that there are people out there who have this seed inside them that wants to serve, wants to have purpose, and feels like they need to make a difference in life. And I certainly had that from my very first day. I think I had it growing up and wanting to do something that made a difference in the world. And, again, none of us do it for the money. The NHS staff here today, the NHS nurses I know, they certainly do not do that for the money or the lifestyle. They do it because they want to serve. And same with firefighters, police, first responders, all of those people that go under that umbrella. we have this thing inside us that wants to serve, which will be there for life, and that makes things very difficult when you then leave the forces or any of those jobs.
Yeah.
And you go into a job that doesn't match that profile. It's extremely difficult to start adapting to a job where you don't have that purpose and you don't feel that serving thing. And I think that's you can't get rid of it. It's a seed and it's inside you.
Yeah. I 100% agree. And I think I've gone from, having that, where I've gone from having that job of being not purpose, like, you've got a mortgage, you're paying, but there's something else, being being in the armed forces or being a first responder. It's just that purpose that gets you up out of bed and you want to go to, and it's not for the money. I can tell you right now,
Yeah.
it's not for the money, because I can tell you what, you get a lot more in the private sector, that's for sure. But it's that willingness to give back. And how I sort of live it by, Liz, is that I'm there to help someone on their worst day, when everything's when they're going through the hell on earth and it's their worst day that they've ever faced in their life. I'm there to restore them their normality, and that's what that for me, that's my driving factor. And there's no better thing than fighting a fire, and you've been in the heat of a battle, and you save someone's house, and then they come out and give you a big hug and a cup of tea. That's it for me. That's the biggest reward, that when they give you, a complete stranger gives you a hug and gives you a cup of tea. It's just like, that's worth it. You've saved that to them. That's their life. Like, their house is their life, and it's any service. It's the willingness to give back. And exactly right. Like, you wouldn't, and I know you, and I know what you and I have become good friends. And you sitting behind a desk doing that was never going to be your, your life. Never
No,
for you.
not
No.
for me.
So, and for you, over your 10 deployments, did you see a big change in the country, like going forward through those 10, from where you were in 2005 to your last deployment, which was 2012? That was your last deployment?
No, 2017. No, sorry, 14.
14.
Yeah.
So was there a big change in what you had seen? Like, obviously for the Afghan, but had the country like gone forward in those years, but then it was slowly starting to go back to what it was when you first went in, or?
We were very much above the battlefield and flying into the FOB. So for me to pick up the kind of local politics, there'd be much better people to answer that question, the guys on the ground who were involved with the elders. But what I did see was, the country got given the chance to vote. They had governance, they had structure. There was a huge program put in for schooling. And I think the probably most noticeable thing would be that, I wasn't walking around, the DC hubs and seeing females out in the streets, but we could see kids flying kites. And in the early days, there's a very famous book called The Kite Runner, about a child in Afghanistan, and the Taliban wouldn't allow kites to be flown. And when we first arrived, you would never see children out flying kites, but you could see them over the last couple of years. And I think, that in itself just showed the freedom that, the villagers could now enjoy. So there was definitely more structure put into the country by the time we left. And seemingly when we did leave in 2014, that was still in place. It seemed pretty well set up. There was governance, there was a voting system. There was also the Afghan National Army. A huge amount of effort had gone in from all our British troops to train them up with their skill sets. And they even had a special forces element as well. So, and from the early days when we first used to fly the ANA, as they were called, the Afghan National Army, in the early days, it was like a comedy sketch getting them on and off the aircraft. But by the end of the campaign, their drills were all right. They weren't bad, and they certainly knew which end of the rifle went bang and which way to point it when they're in the back of a Chinook, not at me, and certainly not at the roof. But so we had just seeing that the work that the British troops put into that, to be able to create a framework and a structure for the country as a whole to go forward and kind of self-manage was huge. And I also saw a huge difference in the British forces. Maybe it was me getting older as the years went on. I'm sure that's part of this. But, I remember flying some young lads as the campaign went on. And, it seemed like the whole forces just got younger. Yes, I was getting older, so obviously the gap was increasing. But by the end of the campaign, I wrote a poem about it actually a few months or a few years ago. But some of the guys who were flying, I thought, you're not even meant to be out at night time. You're so young. And a lot of those guys had joined up because they saw what was happening on the news and they just wanted to join the military. So the Afghan campaign was a huge recruitment drive, really, which is, again, it's that need to serve. Those people who had the seed inside them saw what was going on and wanted to join up. So there was a huge influx of young guys joining the military. And I saw that as a ripple effect on the back of my aircraft, flying basically what looked like a bunch of teenagers into a battlefield. But I also saw so many more females by the end of the campaign. In the early days, in my career, certainly, we would fill up the aircraft every day, and you'd be lucky if you had a female, once a week sometimes. And there used to be a bit of a joke because the pilots could smell them, and they said, have we got a female on board? And they'd be like, get her in the jump seat, which is the seat right at the front between the two pilots. And I was like, hang on a minute. No, we're not playing that game of get the females up. There's like 20 other blokes here. Can one of them not go up? And then, no, get the women up. So there's no two ways about it. That stuff did go on. But, I was always like, for every girl that you get up front and you get to sit in the jump seat, I'm taking one of the lads onto the ramp with me, which is the best seat in the house. So I would make sure that if there was a chick going forward to have that seat at the front, I was going to take one of the lads and put him on the ramp with me. But, yeah, by the end of the campaign, nearly every time we lifted, there was females on the back of the aircraft, and they were dog handlers, interpreters, medics, embedded with the guys, and they would carry the same kit, and they would run out of that ramp into the Bondu, and they would go on patrol, go into the FOBs for weeks on end. And I had so much respect for those girls because you see all these headlines about the first para, the first SF girl, all these things that are making headlines, but actually females in the forces have been doing this for years and they've never wanted a headline about it. And that's very much a thread throughout my book, is that if you think you deserve some kind of fanfare and red carpet rolled out for being a female doing the job, then it's almost like accepting that you're not capable of doing it in the first place. Just get your head down, get on with it. Just be the best person at that job, and you'll get so much more respect from the lads if you do that. It certainly stood me well in my career, but I had so much respect for those girls because, I think, yes, my job was pretty manual, and, wearing helmet and body armor and humping and dumping 40 Bergens a day, it was not easy on the body. It was certainly not easy on my neck, which eventually gave up.
Yep.
But those girls were yomping around the battlefield, and I have massive respect to them. So if any of them are watching, I've got a huge amount of respect for them. But yeah, that's how the British forces changed as well throughout the campaign.
So for you, was like, did you ever have that when the other girls came in, or they were pretty switched on in what they wanted to be there with you? There was no red carpet, like they wanted to be with you and do the job?
Yeah, I'm very lucky. I think the Chinook force as a whole is very lucky in that there's quite a lot of selection processes and sort of gateways before you get to the front line. So, we're quite good at picking out the right people for the right role, and anyone who isn't necessarily that kind of like grin and bear it, get on with it, pee behind a bush, that kind of girl, they're not for the front line. They're not for Chinooks. They're the kind of girls who, and there's no disrespect to them, but there are courses for courses and square pegs, square holes and all that jazz. But they would have been sent to a different platform potentially, and it sounds bad, but females and women who have already got families, the front line is not the place for them, and it's not fair on them, and it's not fair on a family because it's a huge ask. So they would be better suited in a different role. And it's not to take away from anything from them as a woman, but just there's certain goalposts you've got to meet to be able to do certain jobs. So I was very lucky that all the females that came behind me, in the heyday, I think we had 5 of us on the squadron, maybe 6 at one point. And I remember having to queue for there was only one female toilet on the squadron, and we were having a flight safety day, and I went up for a tinkle, and there was 5 other girls all queuing, and I was like, well, this never happens. And it was actually really novel. But we were thick as thieves. We were like a real good close-knit group because and we all just had a very similar mindset, just get on with the job, bit of banter. I was called Doris. And when the rest of the girls arrived, it was Doris number 2, there was Doris number 3, and it was all banter, and we had a great laugh doing it. So and some of them are still there. There's one girl particularly who's still there. She's still flying the flag, and I think she will probably beat my record in a few years' time. But she is pulling her weight and more, and doing me proud. Certainly, she's just become an instructor, so I'm immensely proud for her journey. But yeah, it's yeah, we were always unique.
Absolutely, and I love that when Doris. That was a great mention in the book, and I love that. That was really good. Gave me a bit of a laugh. But for you, looking back now of your time, your last deployment in Afghanistan, were you like a bit of sadness that you were leaving, but also joy to get back home and know that you didn't have to go back to Afghanistan again? What was that feeling like for you?
I remember my last lift in Helmand, and I put it in the book. Actually, I wrote about it in the book because we lifted. We were already pulled the entire fleet back to Kandahar at this point. So all the Chinooks were based out of Kandahar, but the C-17 that was taking us back to the UK was at Bastion. So we, funny enough, then had to be a passenger on our own Chinook to then be flown back to Camp Bastion to take off. And it's very, very rarely that you were ever a passenger in the back of a Chinook in Helmand. You were usually operating. So I remember sitting there, and as we took off, looking out into the ramp, and the hot air from the engines was mixing with the airflow, and you kind of get a ripple effect at the back, like a hazy kind of view. And as we lifted out of Kandahar, looking out the ramp and feeling hugely overwhelmed with emotion. So I put my dark visor down so that nobody could see me cry. But I remember searching that day for my emotions and thinking, what am I crying for? Am I relieved or am I sad? And it was sadness. I was really sad it was over, because coming back to that, feeling of purpose, it was done. And I think maybe there was a tinge of we've made it out alive, probably in there as well. But I think the overwhelming thing was, I was really sad it was done. Really sad it was over. What doesn't break us makes us, as they say. And Afghanistan certainly made me. It changed me absolutely as a person. It taught me some life lessons that I'll never forget. And it also gave me it made me understand the value of life, I think. And, I massively believe, and you can't really understand the value of life and love until you see those things taken away. And, coming back to seeing some of the guys take their last breaths at my feet, and watching whilst their colleagues saw that happen, that's what loss feels like. But you can only feel that loss if you feel true love. And I was really sad when it ended, actually, really sad. But life goes on, came back here to the UK, and kind of, sadly, the world doesn't stop turning the whole time you're deployed. So you're just back into the rat race of the UK, and you have to carry on from there, regroup.
And I know for you, and I know that comes through in your book, is that you're proud, like your proudest time was being in the MERT, being part of that. Like that was, I could see that in your writing, that you were really proud of that, and it shows. Like you've just summed it up. What a war is. It's life and death. You live or you die. There's, that's essentially what a war is. And for you, the way your career ended, and we'll get into that now. You mentioned your neck, and it was so. What was that like for you? After 15 years, you started to develop really, really bad neck pain, and for you, being you, Liz, and this is you, just because I know you just went, no, it's all good, I'm good, and then just tried to keep going, and then, but I'll let you tell a story of how it ended, and it was a really abrupt way to end your flying career, wasn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. So my neck, it had been hurting for a few years, and as you said, I kind of managed it and through. And it's like anything when you're at work. It's only when you take your first day off, you always get sick, don't you? You always get sick on your first day of leave, don't you? And as soon as we came back from Afghanistan, my neck really started to play up, and it was almost like I'd been ignoring it the whole time, or I hadn't even registered it because there was a job at hand to be done. So it started to play up when we first came back from Helmand, and I kind of brassed it out for a bit, and then eventually a colleague convinced me to go to the doc about it, because I knew instantly I was going to get grounded, because there's so many aircrew with back and neck issues because of the kit that we wear. We're wearing body armor, we have our helmet on our head all the time, and then at night time we put our NVGs, which are our night vision goggles, on the front, and to make sure that they don't slide forward, we put a counterbalance weight on the back. So you're essentially like tripling the weight of your head, which if I was sat on a stool like I am today, sitting upright, that probably wouldn't be that much of a problem, because your body's designed to carry that through the middle. But when you're hanging out underneath a helicopter or out the side of a helicopter and moving your neck in a swivel, it doesn't bode well. So my neck, anyway, had given up. I went to the doc, did get grounded, and then went through various rehab courses here in the UK, one of which was at Headley Court, which was the Centre of Excellence for Rehab. And it really dawned on me then, sort of the impact of the Afghan war, because I went to heavy court in 2018 and it was like a ghost town. There was a couple of courses on. I was on a spine course. And I remember saying to one of the chaps how great a facility it was and how big it was, but how empty it felt. And he said at one point there was a waiting list. And that really dawned on me that there's these hundreds of rooms, and there was a waiting list. So, you know, the bottleneck, you know, I was still out in theatre, I was still doing that job out in Afghan, but back here in the UK, these guys were just bottlenecking up, you know, guys who had lost legs and arms and limbs and sight and all sorts of stuff. So that was a massive moment, but sadly they couldn't fix me. They tried everything. I basically damaged 2 vertebrae in my neck that are irreparable. Comes with the territory. I'd flown 3,000 hours on Chinooks at this point, so that was a pretty good innings, and shaken my entire body to death. So I got offered a mid-discharge, and I took it in 2019. January 2019 was my last day in the Air Force, and as you say, it'd been a pretty brutal stop to the end of a career that I could only ever see myself doing till the day I died. You know, I never felt like helicopter crewman was my job. I was a helicopter crewman. It was my being. You know, we have a joke here, you cut me in half, you see a roundel, which is the RAF emblem, and that was me. I was institutionalized. I lived and breathed the Air Force, and it was all I'd ever known. You know, I put that bat suit on every day, as I call it, my flying suit, and I felt like Wonder Woman. You know, it was me. It was my purpose, my identity. And we as aircrew wear our badge on our chest every day, and it says, you know, Liz McConaghy, Chinook crewman. And I often wonder, looking back now, if that was so other people knew who I was, or so I could look at it every day and go, this is who I am. And suddenly that was all gone. So yeah, 2019 was a short, sharp stop to what had been an amazing career after 17 and a half years. So, and then I was out into Civvy Street, you know, not really knowing what to do next.
And let's talk about that for like, and I speak to a lot of veterans who have this very similar, that especially the ones that are medically discharged, they see themselves doing it for life. And for you, that transition was really, really hard. And did you, for you, like you left and you'd slowly became unraveled after a series of traumatic events that compounded into your and I'm going to change this because a friend of mine actually PTSI. So I'm not going to say PTSD. I'm going to say PTSI.
Yeah,
and
I like that.
Yeah, so I'm going to drop the D and put the I in. So can you share with us what happened and why your transition didn't quite go to plan?
Yeah. So, I mean, we have got a great transition kind of workshop here in the UK for coming out of the forces. You know, we get taught how to buy a house and how to have a, you know, start a mortgage and those kind of things, and write a CV, which is great. And all those really good life tools, but not necessarily the inward personality skills of how to unboil. You know, we talked earlier about, you know, the forces are very good at boiling an egg and make you hard inside, but they're not so good at unboiling that egg the other way around. So the things that I had built up over the years in terms of coping mechanisms, like don't cry, because you know you can't cry in a war zone. You can't cry when you see something traumatic because you've got a job to do. You've got to go back into the fight. You know, those 5 guys that we picked up on the stretchers, I can't cry at the back of the ramp. A, it's unprofessional, and B, it's just not what you can do because you're letting your guard down, you're letting your emotions show. So I had spent 17 years learning not to cry, learning not to show any emotion, learning not really to ask for help because I didn't want to be a burden. I never wanted to be that person who had to be a burden on everyone else. So, you know, that's why I was so on top of my game in terms of sports and running. I didn't want to be the girl at the back who couldn't keep up anymore, like basic training. So I was on top of everything. And, you know, that's all. And the same with like timekeeping we mentioned earlier. You know, you're so used to being on time for everything in the forces, or being 5 minutes early, as the saying. You know, I got so stressed as a civvy if I was stuck in a traffic jam and I was going to be late for something, even though nobody's life was at stake, but it was stressing me out massively. But as 2019 kind of went on, life seemed okay. You know, I was working for a charity, so I had a bit of purpose back again in life. It was a disabled flying charity, so they were amazing. A charity called Airability here in the UK. And funny enough, some of the people we were flying as part of that were a lot of the veterans that I picked up off the battlefield. So a huge sense of purpose back. And I think as long as I could keep that purpose, I knew, you know, looking back now, I was okay. Now, 2020 came, March 2020, certainly for us here in UK soils, and that's when COVID hit. And our world got locked down on the 23rd of March. And suddenly, literally overnight, no purpose, no routine, no reason to get out of bed anymore. And that hit me like a ton of bricks. So in the early lockdown here in the UK, you were only allowed out for 10 minutes exercise a day. Now, from someone who had run pretty much marathons, nearly, you know, 3 or 4 marathons a week, as a coping mechanism to suddenly being told you can go out for 10 minutes a day. You know, I didn't even put my trainers on because it wasn't worth it for that. And that routine then manifested, and I stopped doing any of the things that I used to do as a coping mechanism, and any of the things that used to bring me joy. So I stopped cycling. Obviously, all the pools were closed, the gym was closed, all those things that had kept me contained and in a level playing field and helped me empty my bucket. So that was one part of the picture, is that all those coping mechanisms were gone. And the other part of the picture was that I had lots of spare time to revisit my thoughts, and all those thoughts I'd stored away over the years and never really looked at. Plus, I had, no routine, and that's something that all veterans will say that keeps us on the straight and level. Is that routine every day? You get up, you go to the gym, you go to the squadron, you go to wherever you're working, or you do that on the way home. But we have this routine, and suddenly I had nothing. Something that I built my entire life around and was gone, and unraveled as the year went on. So I would go up and down and have good days and bad days. Some days, we get back, and when the first lockdown finished and things started to open up a bit, I sort of tried to get back on my bike, tried to get running, but this kind of feeling had started to manifest. And I knew it was in a really dangerous place when one night I couldn't sleep, and I developed insomnia really badly because, again, if you have no routine, if you're not exercising, if you're staying at home watching Netflix endlessly and eating junk food, which I was doing to kind of lift my mood, and that's another really bad thing that a lot of people suffering with a trauma injury or mental health in any way, you rely on food, I guess, and sugar to kind of lift your mood, because sugar almost has the same effect as exercise. It kind of gives you a boost for a while, but then it goes again. And I was eating more and more sugar to try and lift my mood, and then not wanting to exercise because I felt so crap on the downer. And it's almost like doing cocaine. Being addicted to sugar is the same as being addicted to cocaine. So this was all leading to insomnia. And then I found myself one night at 4 o'clock in the morning when I couldn't sleep, and I got my laptop out and I was Googling. I had my logbooks with me, and I was Googling some of the soldiers that I picked up on Mert who had paid the ultimate price and hadn't made it home. And that is something that I'd never done in my entire career before, because that was such dangerous behavior for us. We all knew that. We thought, don't personalize the body bags. It's a really precious piece of freight. You have to get it back to Bastion. It's a job to be done, but don't personalize it. And the odd time we would catch the Sky News or whatever, like a day or two afterwards, and you'd know who it was, or you'd see a snippet of their face on the picture on the news. But in the main, we tried not to look into it too much. And here I was looking these guys up, and one of the guys had been engaged just before he'd gone out to theatre and never made it home, and others had families and whatnot. And I knew, like, if alarm bells were going to ring anywhere, they were ringing. Red flags were going everywhere, and still I didn't reach out for help. And I think that's mainly because I didn't want to be a burden. During lockdown, everybody was going through something, weren't they? Everyone was struggling. So why does anyone really need to hear my woes? So I just kept it contained. And then very quickly, from we had a heat wave here in August, and the insomnia got worse, and I started taking a drug called amitriptyline to help me sleep, which had been prescribed for my neck many years before. And amitriptyline, I didn't know it at the time, is a very dangerous drug. It's also an antidepressant, which had never been described it for. But I took it from a Sunday night, Monday night, Tuesday night, and I woke up on the Wednesday and felt like I'd been body snatched by the Grim Reaper. And I thought, today is going to be the last day on Earth, and spent the entire day essentially planning my suicide. And, I look back now, and it was like an out-of-body experience. I got really scared when I woke up with those suicidal thoughts, because I'm not that kind of person. And, I'm usually quite bubbly. So I called my GP, asked for some help. The initial response was, can you call back tomorrow? Which did make me chuckle. But again, we were in COVID time, so maybe let them get away with that one. But when I broke down in tears on the phone, they said, no, we'll get the doctor to call you this afternoon. So the doc called me that afternoon, prescribed me some more antidepressants, didn't look to see what medication I was already on or ask if I was taking anything else, which would have been a very vital question at the time, I think, looking back in hindsight. But he just prescribed me more antidepressants. And I went across that afternoon and picked up 2 bags of drugs, one with sertraline in it, which is an antidepressant, and another one with the amitriptyline in it, which I'd reordered, and went home at midnight, took all of them, 95. And I had no emotion throughout the entire day. It was like I'd blocked everything out. I was like a robot. I describe it a little bit like, being at a water park and having my donut. I had my donut at the top of the slide, and I was only going one way that day. I think, I even wrote a suicide note to my parents, and I've always thought of suicide as a very selfish thing to do. And here I was, completely emotionless, void of any tears, writing to my parents, and just, like robotic actions. So, for anyone who's listening to this who has been affected by suicide, there's always these wake-up questions of, what could I have done? How could I have changed the outcome of that day? And the truth be told, the mindset I was in that day, I was in the departure lounge of life. And even if Daniel Craig had come around for dinner that night, I was still intending to do what I was going to do. Nobody could have stopped me, because I was past the point. And I refer to it a lot now as the river of depression. And if you know anyone who's on that river of depression, up and down, as I was, you don't know where the waterfall is. You don't know how close it is. And I went over the edge of that waterfall in literally 24 hours. And I think that's a really important thing for anyone to know. If you're on the river and that's you, or if you think you know someone who is on that river, just keep an eye on them, talk to them, make these conversations happen, because you don't know how quick that's going to come, and then you're past the point of return. So so took it, and
I know, and that's the part of the book where I burst into tears, because I know exactly what you're saying, because I was there, and 9 years ago, actually next month, and it's ironic that you and I share the same date a month apart. So the 14th of it's 14th of August for you, 14th of September for me. 2014 was my, and I know that I'm nearly crying now, because I know what you're saying. You're emotionless. You don't feel and my mum asked me only a couple, because as I've said to you, I've just written my book, and we'll get into the book after in a minute, but I know exactly. My mum said the same thing. Well, where was I? Why didn't you tell me? Like, what was going on? And I said, Mum, I didn't want to burden you with the pain. I just wanted the pain to stop. That was what it was. And for you, it was the same thing. It was just that pain of, I just don't want to be. It's and I say it in the book too, and I love you with your book, because you said it that you didn't want to die. You just wanted the pain to stop. That was what it was. And anyone who goes through that, Liz, knows that you don't really want to die. You just want that pain to stop. It's just that constant pain and that like same thing. People have said to me, suicide is the most cowardly thing that you can do. And I've learned through, and you've learned through my psychologist, and there's you're not thinking straight. You're not thinking clearly. There's chemicals there's a chemical imbalance in your brain that you're not doing. It's not normal behavior. Like, and as you're saying, and for you, what, like, if you can talk us through, Liz, like you go into in depth in the book, but if you can give us a sense of what you remember, and then what you remember after you'd woken up.
Yeah, and I would just want to touch on what you said about the chemical imbalance. So, from the day you put on a uniform in the military, you are taught to go to the fight. Now, whether or not that is standing on a parade square and someone screaming in your face and you not running away, which is, again, that's fight or flight response, isn't it? And you're overcoming, because if someone's screaming in your face, the normal human reaction, run away. And you're taught from day one to stand and take that. Same for shooting a weapon on the range in basic training. You were taught to shoot that weapon, hold that weapon, and not recoil in fear and run away. So whether or not you ever go to a battlefield or battle zone, it doesn't matter in the forces. From the very day one, you're taught to overcome your fight response. And that is essentially overcoming a reasoned thought process in your head, because your reasoned thought will be like, there's a lion in the room, run away. And as military people, you're taught, no, stay in the room with the lion. And overcoming response over and over again, you essentially overcome your reasoned thought. On that particular day that I was planning, my reasoned thought was out the window. And it was such a normal thing to do. It felt to me like the most normal thing in the world. So as the day panned out, I went and got my lethal drugs about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Just to give you a flavour of the mindset I was in. I came home, I tidied my apartment, I had dinner. I then, after writing the suicide note to my parents, I then took a shower, did my hair and makeup, and then at midnight took 95 of the amitriptyline. And thankfully, I didn't wash them down with any alcohol. I'm very much a social drinker. I'm in the forces. I'm Irish. I love a drink, but I've never used drinking as a coping mechanism, thankfully. And I think that's probably something that saved my life that night. I also live very close to the hospital, which is another reason I'm probably here talking to you today, because if I hadn't lived opposite the hospital, don't think I would have made it. But after taking the pills, I woke up. So took all pills and don't remember anything after that. The next thing I remember was I woke up 2 days later. I didn't know it was 2 days later. I woke up in a hospital bed and there was faces all in front of me. I had a tube down my throat and I felt like I was drowning. And I remember trying to clutch at this tube and feeling literally like I couldn't breathe. And I got put back to sleep again. And the next time I came around, the faces were there again. There was a clock at the end of the wall and it said 6:30 in the morning. And I thought it was the next day, and it wasn't. It was 2 days later. And it turns out I'd been on life support for 48 hours. So the doctor started explaining that I was okay. I was in Basingstoke Hospital in HDU, high dependency unit there. And I had been brought in by ambulance. And I remember just lying there really not knowing what was going on. I didn't know how I'd been brought in. You know, once my sort of brain kicked in, I was like, who found me? What happened? And they eventually took the tube out of my throat. And I remember even trying to speak at that point and I couldn't. There was so much damage done to my throat. So I just had all these questions. And it's like, you know, when you have a big night drinking and you don't remember how you got home,
Yep.
Imagine that times 10. Imagine not knowing how you're actually alive and actually what had happened. So, you know, I eventually figured out that I had to call the ambulance. And I only found this out about 2 days later when I eventually got released from hospital and I got home and got reunited with my phone, which had been left in my apartment. And myself and my best friend went through the phone, and it turned out that I called the Samaritans, which say a help group. I don't know if they're worldwide actually, or they're a UK thing, but Samaritans are sort of a helpline here. And I called them for 13 seconds. And then the next phone call I made was to 911, which here in the UK, we should call 999. And I called 911. So I think I've been watching too much Netflix during lockdown. But anyway, the important thing is it gets you through to the right people. And I'd made that call about 10 to 1. And that was I was on the phone to them for about 11 minutes. And that's obviously the phone call that saved my life. So I guess coming back to our point earlier about not actually wanting to die, there is a will inside us all to live. No matter how much you feel like you want to die, there is a subconscious will inside you that will fight for your life. And it's clearly that night, even though I don't remember the phone calls, something kicked in and made me want to fight for my life. And, you know, that's where your will inside you will always win through. You know, despite the fact that in my head that day, my reason thought wasn't working and I thought I wanted to die, my will saved me. So I was very lucky. I still think I had a guardian angel looking over that night, who's another crew girl who sadly passed away from cancer a few years ago. But, you know, up there in the big sky, looking down at me and looking after me. So yeah, I spent another few days in hospital, eventually got released and got home and went into the veteran mental health system. And I remember feeling quite euphoric on leaving hospital, thinking, well, that's it, really. It's, you know, the worst day of your life is the day you try to kill yourself. It can't really get any worse than this, and the only way is up. And oh my God, I was so wrong. You know, the hardest battle of my entire life was about to begin, and that was basically putting it back together. You know, I think if I'd have just scooped up all those files that I'd thrown out that day, you know, all over the floor, if I'd have just scooped all those memories and those things back up and shoved them back in the box at the back of my brain, I'd be a ticking time bomb today waiting to go off again. But the important thing was to go through all the PTSD counselling with the charities here in the UK and read each of those files, you know, each of those memories I'd had and those things I'd seen in Afghanistan, process them, and most importantly, cry about them. And I spent a lot of time crying on my PTSD calls because, you know, I'd stored 17 years worth of tears up. And, you know, I equate it now to, you don't fall and cut your knee and not expect it to bleed. So why would you ever expect to see trauma, experience death, experience loss and not cry as well? It's normal to cry. And, you know, I kick myself all the time now if I do cry in public, which I do a lot now when I'm telling my story. I sometimes, you know, break down and cry, and I always I'm sorry, and then I kick myself for doing it and say you should never apologize for crying because it is a normal response to trauma. So I spent a lot of time crying and a lot of time processing things and then storing them all back where they should be, and they're now tucked away in the back of my brain. And yeah, but they're there, and I know they're there, and I can revisit them when I need to. And instead of seeing them as some kind of weird Pandora's box, which is locked in like a dangerous thing, and I think that's a kind of a term that a lot of veterans use for those things. They almost don't want to open Pandora's box. But it's like having, you know, a bomb in the back of your brain waiting to go off. And sometimes maybe opening the box and talking about it before you need to is a good thing. You know, don't be scared of it. Those are memories that have shaped you and you can learn from. So instead of being scared of it, open it up on your own terms and start to take the files out, acknowledge them, decompress from them and then pop them back in there again instead of letting the box blow up someday like I did.
Well, and so, and for you, it's a really great point you touch on. And part of that healing process was writing Chinook Crew Chick. And where did that come from? And for you, like, I know for me, it was such a cathartic experience getting what I'd experienced, getting my traumas out onto paper. And I wrote mine simply just to help one person. But for you, where did that come from? And was that part of your journey with going through your process of healing?
Yeah, so it was very much that. It was a cathartic process. One of my counselling sessions, the counsellor said to me, you know, what made you want to join the RAF? You know, the same little girl is there who wanted to join the RAF at 17. That same young, naive, excited Liz is the same Liz. It's just all the stuff that in the between had mashed her up. So that got me thinking, is like, you know, who was Liz day one? So I started to write basic journal, you know, why did I want to join the Air Force, and wrote chapter 1 and then chapter 2. And then eventually within 3 weeks, I'd written the bare bones of the book. Well, I'd say the bare bones, actually the bulk of the book. And it just stayed on my laptop for ages because it was just done as a cathartic experience. And then I was out walking with my best friend during, I guess, lockdown 4 or something here in the UK. We had so many. And I sort of laughed and said to her, you know, don't laugh, but I think I've written a book. And she said, why would I laugh? That's amazing. You should send it to me so I can read it. So I did. I emailed her over and she came back within 2 days and said, Liz, this is really good. You should send it to some publishers. So I kind of scattergunned it out, not really thinking anything was going to happen. And then a publisher called Pen and Sword here in the UK came back to me and said, Liz, we would love to publish your book. So it was, you know, something so positive came out of something so negative. So did a bit more work on the book, a bit of editing with their editors and whatnot, and filling in the gaps because it wasn't quite, you know, big enough to be published at this point. So I had to add in a few more stories, which was not a problem because, you know, had I known it was ever going to be published in the first place, they probably would have been in there to begin with. And then it hit the streets in September last year and it sold out within 24 hours, which was amazing. It went to #1 bestsellers in Air Force biographies and military on Amazon. And it just, the world changed overnight for me, really. And, you know, I still had this huge imposter syndrome. I remember the first book festival I went to where I had to give a talk. And you know, one of the British celebrity writers was there. And she said to me, so are you an author, dear? And we were sat in the green room and I said, no, I'm not an author. I'm a Chinook crewman. And she goes, well, what are you doing here today then? And I said, well, I wrote a book. And she went, so you're an author? And I was like, well, I guess I am. And it took me a long time to get my head around the fact that I am an author. And I think that's also one of the positive things that came out of my therapy was that feeling of, you know, one of my therapists said to me, you keep looking back, Liz, you keep searching for the Liz before COVID, the Liz that could run this far, could run this fast, could do all these things. And that's quite destructive. You know, that's like looking for missing persons is a very destructive way to live your life because you never get closure. You need to let that person die and you need to embrace the new person who is a survivor, an author, a veteran. And that was the first time I was able to call myself a veteran and be really proud of it. Instead of saying I used to be a Chinook crewman, I'm a veteran, and that even that language of I am is so much more positive than I used to be. So, you know, I urge anyone who has come out of the forces to embrace what you are now, not what you used to be. And yeah, I was able to say I'm an author. So, you know, just using that positive language has really changed life. But most importantly, since the book came out, it's given me that huge sense of passion and purpose again. The things I really missed in the military, I have back now in the form of that book and the identity. You know, I'm Chinook Crew Chick now, and lots of people know that. But every day, I get messages from people who have read the book or heard a podcast and say, Liz, totally resonate with that. Or your book really touched me at, you know, thinking about the time in Afghanistan, or I talk about my friend who lost to cancer in it. And there's so many things in my story. You don't have to be military to resonate with, you know, loss of a friend to cancer. I went through a messy divorce, you know, the whole time in a war zone, you know, all those things. Everyone goes through something, you know, you don't have to be a soldier to feel all those pressures in life. And then one day they just got on top of me. You know, I will never put my entire, you know, suicide attempt to just my time in Helmand. It was a cumulative effect of everything. I call it the domino effect in the book because it was just the dominoes kept toppling, and one day they just got too heavy for me and I crumbled. And I think that's a life lesson for everyone. So having the fact that people reach out to me now about the book and it's helping people with their mental health, it's catapulted me into the speaking circuit, and now I routinely give, talks about my story. And again, I'm not a trained psychologist, I'm not a doctor, I can't tell people how to get better. I can just tell them my story and hope that they can take away the lessons from it and never ever go down the same path that I did, because I'm very lucky that I survived. And I think that's, an important thing to do, is just put my story out there, be brave, and let people take what they need to from it.
And I think,
yeah.
and you do that really well. And that's why I wanted to get you on, because I resonated with it straight away. I read it and I was like, straight away, I think within reading the first 10 pages, I'm like, Liz, I have to get you on the podcast. I need to. And, you and I have become friends, and I'm grateful for your friendship, because you are, and we check in on each other all the time, and that's it. We're different sides of the world, but it's nice to know that there's mates. And that's what I get from your book, is that you just check in on people and just make sure that they're okay, and just, send them a message and say, hey, how you going? Are you okay? Like, and
really? Yeah.
that's what it is. And the thing, like you said, it was the domino effect. And like you said, the thing that really broke me up towards the end of your book was your divorce. And as you said, you had friends choose sides, and it was, that was really hard, because it happens all the time. Like, you see it all the time with people that's what they do. They pick a side. They go, oh, I'm on that side, or I'm on that side. And yeah. And that really, I was like, oh, and like you said, people still haven't checked in on you since that day. And that's really sad. That's really, really sad to see.
Yeah. But I do think, it is sad, and I've lost a few friends who I guess you wouldn't call friends through the divorce. But I also think, in hindsight, there's a thing, everyone's perception of a truth is different. And, you can look at a yellow lampshade and someone will say, well, it's gold. And I'll say, well, it's yellow. And everyone's version of the truth can be different, no matter what. Someone can taste something and say, this is yummy, someone else doesn't. But it doesn't mean that either's wrong. It just means that people have perceptions of stuff. And I think, even warm, something that's really warm outside, and I'm like, it's not warm, I'm cold, but it's your perception of something. And I think, that's what I've learned through my divorce, is that, and I think any of those kind of arguments in life that we have with people, big arguments, everyone has a perception of what's wrong and what's right. And if the two don't marry up, then people always end up parting ways. And it's a really sad thing to go through a divorce, but it's mostly sad to lose friends through it who you've known for your whole life, and before you even married. And I think that's something, it's taken me a long time to come to terms with that, I think, as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I think what I live by, the mantra, is that don't judge a book by its cover. And a thing that I live by is don't judge a person by what chapter you walk into on their life. Like, you don't know what they've gone through. And that's a big thing. That's a really thing that I live by, and it's serving well, and basically, Liz, what I live by is treat people the way you want to be treated. That's essentially, that's what it is. That's,
okay.
and that's, if we all did that, the world would be a better place. It would be a much better place. But so, Liz, knowing what you know now and everything that you've been through, was joining the RAF still the greatest decision of your life?
Absolutely. If I could swear in that sentence, I would swear, because absolutely it was the best career I could ever want. I often say, if I could have anything in life, eternal life, all the money in the world, or rewind a button and go back to the start and do it all again, I'd go back and do it all again. I wouldn't rejoin. That's a very different kettle of fish. I think the Air Force has significantly changed now, and there's a lot more red tape. And again, like we said, there's no war zones to go and fight in anymore. But if I could go back to the start and do it all again, it was an amazing career. I'd recommend anyone, from any country, to look at a career in the forces as a fantastic kind of journey through life, because the experiences you get, the friends that you will have forever, and the life lessons it teaches you, they're there forever. They're there for life.
Absolutely. And what advice, Liz, would you give to anyone who is looking at joining the RAF and to become a Chinook crewman?
I guess, talk to aircrew about it, because, we do, certainly here in the UK, well, the Chinook display is amazing. It's absolutely phenomenal. And you know, those aircrew go to all the air shows and they're walking around in their flying suits, and sometimes people are very scared to approach them because they think they're sort of superhuman, and they're not. They're just normal people like me who love chatting to people. You know, I love when people come up to me at the end of a talk and share their stories with me. So go and find out about it. You know, talk to those people and do your research. You know, I wouldn't necessarily say watch films because they're not exactly always truthful, but you know, go and speak to your local careers office. The internet is a fantastic tool for that now, so go and look stuff up. But dream big. You know, if I looked at my 17-year-old self and thought, you know, from having never ever been to England, never been in the back of a helicopter, and have no experience in the military whatsoever, you know, I was never a cadet or anything like that, to be able to go, yeah, I want to go and fly on the biggest British helicopter that we operate with the biggest weapon that we operate and go and fly in a war zone. You know, how is that ever going to be possible? If I'd have let imposter syndrome kick in there and I think, no, it's not possible, then I never would have achieved it. And the whole point with the forces is that they take you through step by step. You know, they hold your hand. They never expect you to do anything without teaching you how to do it first. And, you know, so don't get overwhelmed by the end goal. Just look at the first step. And yeah,
I think that's great advice. And knowing what you know now, what advice would you give your 18-year-old self, and would she listen?
This is my favorite question I get asked, and I thought long and hard about what I would say. And the truth is, I wouldn't tell her anything because I don't want to spoil the surprise. You know, again, we've already said it, I had the best career ever, and half of that was the naivety and the excitement that went with that. And I think if I knew what was coming, I wouldn't have enjoyed it as much. So I would not tell her a single thing and just keep still.
I love that. That's awesome. So what are your plans going into the future, Liz? What do you want to do going forward?
So I'm loving doing the talks at the minute. It's really making a difference in life. And again, every time I tell my story, it's quite cathartic for me. But I've got a couple more books lined up. So I'll hopefully write a sequel to Chinook, and all the things that have happened to me since September last year, because it's been a crazy journey already and we're not even a full year in yet. So, you know, that will be a book in the making, because I certainly don't want to start and finish that too early when there's even more exciting things on the horizon. But I'm going to write a book with some colleagues of mine about our time in 18th Squadron, which was the squadron I served most of my time in Helmand with. And, you know, that squadron were the first squadron over the border in Iraq. So they've got some stories to tell about that as well. And I think, you know, everyone, the joke is everyone's got a book in them. You just have to have time to write it. And, you know, I do think that's true. But I'd love to be able to give a voice to the, you know, the rest of the squadron. You know, everyone glamorizes the pilots. I finally told a bit of the crewman story, but also there are, you know, engineers, armorers, the opsies that, you know, do our bookings. For all of those people come to war with us, and they all see the same war but through very different eyes, and the things that keep them awake at night will be very different to what keeps me awake at night. So I'd love to be able to capture those thoughts from Helmand really and Iraq, and to basically, you know, capture that all and give them a voice in a chapter each. So watch this space for that.
I'm excited. If it's as good as your book, it's gonna be awesome. So where can people follow you, and how do people get a copy of your book?
So I'm on Instagram, Chinook, and I'm on Twitter, which I only joined last year, and it's gone mad already on there, as Chinny Chick. So please look me up and give me a follow, because I love meeting people. I love engaging with people. And the book is on Amazon. So probably the best way for you guys to get it all the way out there is to look it up on Amazon, Chinook. And yeah, if you do read it, I'd love to hear what people think about it. I love hearing feedback about the book. So yeah, please do.
No, I am gonna absolutely sing your praises to the hills, because it was awesome. As soon as I read it, I reached out to you straight away and just said, Liz, thank you so much for writing your book. And as you say, you're 100% correct. Everyone's got a book in them. And I mean, hey, I haven't did a book, and I had ADD with learning difficulties. So if I can write a book, anyone can write a book. So yeah, you just, as you say, just have the time and break it down, and simply just break it into chapters, and that's how you write a book. That's how I've done it. And you know, as you said, you've helped so many people. I resonated with your story. That's why I wanted to get you on. And can you share with us some of the ambassador work that you're doing for veterans?
Yeah, so I don't know how it happened again. It seems to have like happened by osmosis, but I seem to be kind of this sort of, I guess, ambassador and maybe a voice for some veterans. And and it's probably the power of social media these days, is people that have kind of heard my story. But I'm doing a lot of work with Combat Stress and Help for Heroes now to kind of change that narrative, and also a lot of stuff in and around the compensation scheme that here in the UK, and sometimes it's not necessarily the most beneficial it could be for veterans, mostly because of the red tape within the system itself, but also in people who aren't informed, so I'm trying to do a lot of work in and around that. But yeah, and I won Women in Defence Award a couple of weeks ago, which I couldn't believe. Again, these things are happening to me, and I feel like there's like pinch moments constantly that I'm getting these things, because for someone who spent most of her career not wanting to be singled out as a female doing anything special, it's nice to, I guess, finally get recognized for that. So and I'm nominated for the Woman of the Year award, which is in October, so watch this space. I'm not expecting to win that. There are some amazing people up for nomination, but it's nice to be again even in class in that bunch of ladies. So yeah, and it brings me back that huge amount of purpose. So I've recorded the audiobook recently, and that'll be out in October, and I'm giving the profits from that to a wonderful charity back here in the UK. It's a very small charity called 353, and it's supporting some of the paras that were out in Helmand. So I lived and breathed what they did, and saw most recently some of the guys, spoke to some of the guys who had lost friends and colleagues out there, and it really hit home for me. So if I can give a little bit back to them, then I feel like, again, it's that sense of purpose. So if you've got the book, listen to the audiobook as well, because you're doing a good thing by buying that.
Absolutely, and that's like I love seeing what you do, and you're always out there helping veterans and also now first responders as well. And it's you've got your passion back, you've got you've got the purpose, you're there, and I see it all the time, Liz, and it's an absolute it's a credit to you. And as you say, you've overcome adversity. I love your tattoo of just breathe, and it'll all be okay. And yeah, there it is. And it's just breathe. And as I said to you, I think all veterans, it's very close to your heart that a lot of the veterans aren't getting the support they need, and you're now a voice for the people that don't have a voice, and you're really driving forward in what you're doing, which is I take my hat off to you, and I hope more people jump on with you and jump on board and start getting on stage and saying, hey, there's more that needs to be done, because you guys have you signed a blank check in that you went to serve your country, and that blank check was that it could lead to you giving up your life. And I think it's time that people get behind you guys and start helping you as well as first responders. And it's a great job you're doing. And there's a quote, Liz, that I want to finish with that I really believe sums your story up. And Liz, your story is one of true grit and determination and never giving in. I believe you're an inspiration to many. The quote is from C.S. Lewis, and the quote is, I believe this sums you up. Courage is not simply one of the virtues, but the form of every virtue at the testing point of life is the fullest of testing times. We must just have the courage to withstand them. Liz, thank you so much for your service and everything you do for raising awareness for mental health and helping veterans and first responders. Liz McConaghy, it's been an absolute honour and a privilege to have you on True Blue Conversations and share your story. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much, Adam. And that nearly made me cry at the end. Thank you so much.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of True Blue Conversations with your host, Adam Blum. See you on the front line.